Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I arrived in the car park Monday, 7:29 a.m., taking one of the last remaining parking spaces, later than usual, as I'd stopped off for a triple shot latte. It would be the highlight of my week. I looked out at the office block with its floor-to-ceiling lustered windows and sighed, grabbed my key fob, and trudged my way to another soul-crushing week. I work for a remote typing company. We specialize in medical transcripts received direct from consultants countrywide, which we transcribe and send to a central pool for proofreading before returning to the client. As exciting as it sounds, it was easy work most of the time. What you've heard about the medical profession's handwriting is, however, all true. Thankfully, I mostly transcribed from audio, which had the added benefit of not having to socialize with the rest of the department, or the pack, as I call them. The office was bustling already. The office manager, Josie, filling our in trays with medical notes and any work that needed amending. She waved over to me. I nodded my thanks, made my way over to my desk, and switched on my computer to warm up. It was taking forever these days after the recent system upgrade. Not only did we now have security fobs to access every door in the building, effectively letting Josie know when we arrived, had lunch, went home in the evening, it even recorded when we used the restroom. We also had a new system on the computer letting us know how many people were currently in the building and logged onto the network. Each morning when I logged on, a message box would pop up saying you are staff member 200 and something to log on to the network. Today, I was number 238. As I opened my emails to start the day, the thought of that many people arriving before me when I'd arrived at the crack of dawn made me shudder. The day had gone by uneventfully, and I was getting ready to make my way home. The time between everyone else in my team leaving and me leaving could be anything between half an hour to 2 hours plus. I enjoyed the peace and quiet after everyone had left and usually got most of my billable work done during this time. I was about to log off when a message box flashed up on my screen. You are alone. I stared at it for a moment, not sure if I was looking at an email or an instant message. Then it dawned on me. It was the system letting me know that everyone had now logged off and gone home. Probably something to do with the new lone worker policy. I really should have listened properly during the mandatory training I wasted half a day on last month. Way to go, system. Let me know I have no life and make it sound creepy as hell, why don't you? I muttered to myself as I closed the pop-up and logged off. Tuesdays were one of the days I dreaded the most. Every week, the crazy ladies in the pack would all go out for lunchtime tacos to a nearby Mexican restaurant. They called them Taco Tuesdays. I told you they were crazy. Not only would they never invite me, they would also just presume that I would cover reception for 2 hours plus. If it was busy, that would mean I'd get half my usual workload done and would have to stay even later than usual. The glass theme continued throughout the building, so the reception area and receptionist only had a wall of glass between her and our office. There was, however, a handy sliding partition so we could cover for her when she wasn't around, which was often. This was a cause of conflict amongst the pack. If the intercom buzzed, everyone would stare angrily at each other, trying to remember who had covered last. I mostly got away with it, partly due to being out of line of sight and partly due to not giving a crap. This particular Taco Tuesday, I was deeply engrossed in a report from a pediatric consultant when I heard the intercom buzz. Annoyed with the interruption, I quickly headed to the glass partition, ready to buzz through whoever was waiting to gain access from outside. As I walked over, though, I could see that there was nobody there. There was no way they could have moved away so quickly without me seeing them. Great, I thought. Now the intercom is faulty. What kind of idiot contractors did they get in to do the job? I went back to my desk and sent a quick email to Richard in IT to report the issue. As an afterthought, I mentioned that the new system pop-up that said I was alone in the building was creepy, and could he please switch it off for me? 5 minutes later, I heard someone moving around in the reception area and didn't have to look to know who it was. "Hi, Richard," I called out before heading over. He kind of had a thing for me, so the quick response didn't surprise me. To be honest, I knew he'd sort out my IT issues quicker than any of his colleagues, wanting to impress me with his skills. He was kind of cute in a nerdy way. Hey, Susan, thought I'd come down and have a look at your intercom problem." He smiled shyly, running his fingers through his dark, curly hair before starting to tinker with the intercom. "Hey," I smiled back, making him blush. "How's it looking? I really don't need the interruptions, especially when I'm covering by myself." He rolled his eyes. Yeah, Taco Tuesday. Well, I can't see any problems with it, to be honest, so I'll have the engineer out to have a look at it. Sorry." It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but hey, never mind. The pack would be back soon, then it would be their problem. Richard was about to leave when he turned back to me. "Oh, and the system message you mentioned, you are alone? Not sure what you mean. We don't have anything set up like that, but let me know if it happens again and I'll look into it." I gazed after him and began to doubt myself. Maybe I'd read the message wrong. I had been a little tired and stressed lately. Some of the reports from the children's hospital were particularly upsetting. Yeah, that was probably it. I was the last to leave again that day and was relieved to see that I didn't get another "you are alone" message. Throwing my bag onto the passenger seat and settling into my car, I adjusted the rearview mirror. I froze, gaping at where I'd stood a moment earlier. Crouching by the front door of the office block, there was a figure. It looked female, but that was all I could be sure of. Cloaked in darkness, her outline sizzled with something like electricity. She was bent over on all fours, distorted, flickering like a faulty light bulb. The air around me throbbed, amplifying the sizzling sounds until I felt sick and dizzy. Suddenly, the figure screeched and 4 sets of claws on spindly arms and legs flew out in my direction. I hit reverse and span the car around as the sizzling and screeching sounds became almost unbearably loud. As I got ready to speed away, my headlights illuminated the office entrance. The figure was gone. The sounds cut out, replaced by a thick silence, and I was overcome by a feeling of utter emptiness. I sat, quaking, until the sensation subsided, then drove home in a daze. I went straight to bed with one of the worst migraines I'd ever had, questioning my sanity until the early hours of the morning. I forced myself to go back there the next day. Having other people around would be comforting for once. I arrived amidst the drama of a total system failure. The IT department were baffled by it and advised us all to find non-computer work to do whilst they tried to fix it. This meant that management could retreat to the nearest drinking establishment for the duration. For us minions left behind, we were kind of stuck for something to do, given that our jobs are reliant on having a functioning computer system. I mean, I could have asked the pack if they needed any help, but they were pretty much in the same predicament as me. Plus, I knew they wouldn't help me out, so I took an unapproved early lunch and went to the grocery store nearby. I had a triple shot latte whilst I was there and gave myself a good talking to. Obviously, I was stressed. More stressed than I'd realized. How else could I explain the events of the night before? I mean, what I saw wasn't real. It couldn't be. I was tired, stressed, conjuring up weird crap because a migraine was on its way. Yeah, that was probably it. Uncharacteristically, I bought muffins for the pack to make up for my lack of support and to smooth things over in case I needed help catching up. That, plus I'd failed to bring anything in when I celebrated my 30th birthday earlier in the month. The tradition of having to bring cakes in on your own birthday felt like adding insult to injury, and I hadn't bothered this year. 30, still stuck in this boring job, virtually glued to a screen every week. That stress-induced hallucination was the most exciting interaction I'd had all week. When I got back to the entrance, I noticed that there were no lights on. With it being October, the lights were usually on pretty much all day. I went inside. All the desks were empty, all the computers turned off. Maybe everyone had decided to do the same thing as me and gone on long lunch breaks. I headed to my desk to check if anyone had left me a note. That's when I saw it. My computer was on, static interference crackling and buzzing all over its screen. I stared, transfixed. Then a message box shuddered up. "You are not alone." My eyes darted around the room. "All right, very funny, guys," I called out. "Did Richard put you up to this?" Even as I said it, I knew that wasn't what was happening. Richard wouldn't do anything to jeopardize his chances with me, as slim as they were. The pack didn't have the imagination, personality, or sense of humor to dream up such a prank. Scenarios started to run around my head. Maybe someone else in IT had set up the system message. Maybe it was remote from head office and IT didn't know. Maybe I really was going crazy. I was drawn back to the screen. The static started to intensify, and I heard a scratching sound. It started from the front door, dragging across to the windows, and then back again faster than humanly possible. Dark shadows moved from one side to the other, trailing the scratching sounds. They got louder and began to be accompanied by breathy, wailing screeches that made every window in the room shake. They got louder and louder until I thought my ears would explode. I knew then that I hadn't imagined the night before. She was back, the shadow now clearly her watching me from outside the window, waiting for me to make a move. I put my hands over my ears and screamed at the top of my voice. The computer went blank, and the noises stopped. Her shadow gone. I waited a full hour before making a bolt for my car. It was as if nothing had happened. Complete silence. She was gone, just like the night before. I seriously considered not going in on Thursday, but I wanted answers. Josie was kind of apologetic about not leaving me a note when she'd sent everyone home early the previous day, giving me a strange look when I tried to tell her what had been happening. "You've been working hard lately," she intoned. "Would you like me to refer you to occupational therapy? Perhaps you could talk through your issues with them?" I didn't like the way she said issues. Richard was nowhere to be found. His colleagues had no idea what the static interference could be and knew nothing about the system message. They suggested that I should turn the computer on and off if it happened again. As the day progressed, my unease grew and my courage retreated. I had no idea what I was going to do if she came back again. My only plan was to try to see her more clearly, see who or what I was dealing with, see if I could find a weakness or, at the very least, find out what she wanted from me. One by one, everyone left to go home, and I stared at my computer screen waiting for something to happen. An hour passed. It was now completely dark outside, and I was considering giving up and going home when a message box appeared on my screen, followed by another and another. "You are not alone. I am watching you. I am waiting for you. Are you waiting for me?" This time the messages were accompanied by something else, a timer, counting down from 30. All my bravery and curiosity flew out of the window. I knew I had to get out. I grabbed my keys and phone and ran toward the front door, pausing briefly in fear of what was outside, but knowing I had to take the risk. I made my move and ran toward my car, cursing at having to park further away that day. My phone started to buzz. I turned to look at its screen. 29, 28, 27, 26. I whimpered and picked up speed. The breathy screeches from the previous night started up behind me, the sound of claws tapping against concrete in pursuit. I made it to my car without looking back. As I locked the door, scratching started on the windshield and windows. Dark shadows began to swirl round and round. I dropped my keys and scrabbled around for them before finally managing to start the car. I flew out of the car park on what felt like 2 wheels, but the shadow followed. It kept pace beside my car, scratching at the doors, trying to gain access or toy with me, I didn't know. The navigation system flicked to life, its blurry screen numbering exits that didn't exist. 25, 24, 23, 22, 21. As I joined the main road, I lost track of the shadow, billboards changing in front of me from weather warnings and speed checks to continue the countdown. 20, 19, 18, 17, 16. The car radio switched itself on, but instead of my usual channel, a distorted, cackling voice chilled me to the bone. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11. I finally reached my street and launched myself out of the car. I ran to my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me, checking my phone as I bolted it shut. The countdown had vanished. I didn't go back the next day or the week after. 3 months had passed when I eventually decided to hand my notice in. By email, of course. There was no way I was going back there again. I claimed I was going to take a career break to go traveling. They either believed me or didn't care. I suspected the latter. The truth was, I'd taken some of my clients with me, contacting them directly to say I was now self-employed and would be happy to continue working for them, at a reduced rate, of course. It meant I could work from home, more years of my life spent stuck to a computer screen. The only person upset to see me leave had been Richard, and we arranged to meet up today for a coffee. He wanted to give me a good luck card and a box containing the possessions I'd left at the office. We'd agreed to keep in touch, but I knew we wouldn't. He didn't look at me the same way he used to. The shy glances were gone, and it sounded as if he'd be moving his crush on to someone from the accounts department. Back home, I settled on my sofa and opened the box, knowing the only thing in there I cared about was my iPad. I switched it on, ready for a relaxing night with my reading app. I gasped. The air around me throbbed, and I heard loud scratching on my front door and windows. The iPad screen crackled, and a pop-up message dominated the screen along with a timer. You're never alone. I was about to find out what happened when the countdown reached 0.
I'm sitting in a bar right now, somewhere in the more southern portions of Missouri. Howl County, I think. Haven't bothered to ask. The police are on their way. The owner of the bar called them the moment she saw me stumble through the door. Covered in... She'd been standing at the bar and rushed to grab the phone at the sight of me. A purely instinctive reaction. I must have looked pretty awful. I feel awful. While I'm waiting, I'll type out what happened to me. I'm exhausted, physically, psychologically, spiritually, and I wasn't a spiritual person earlier today. I've been told that it'll take a while for the police to get here, that they usually delay themselves when they get calls from this place. I guess, considering the locale and the present patrons, it's understandable. It's not a friendly-looking place, contrary to the hospitality I've received from its owner. I think the bar wants to give the impression that it's a sports bar. It might have even been one years and years ago, but now it's just a drab, faded place with crooked signs, loosely pinned flags, and dated sports memorabilia. I feel awful. The owner insisted that I give her my jacket. I complied, and I remember it feeling like I had instead removed some weighted thing, a heavy winter's coat or body armor. I don't know what she did with it after putting it in a trash bag, but I think just a moment ago I caught a whiff of something burning, some kind of fabric. I was given a few napkins to wipe my face, and I wasn't surprised to find them lightly dampened with whiskey. My shoulder hurts. the pain is tolerable for now. I've had a few drinks. It's been about 15 minutes, 10 since the shock wore off, and I guess I'll get started now. I've decided to write it out in the hopes that it'll help me forget it later on. I know if I keep it inside, if I allow it to develop in my mind, it'll eventually drive me insane. Please excuse any lapses, wanderings, tangents, etc. It's a hard thing to keep inside, but I'm sure it'll be even harder to let out, to put into a coherent sequence. I'll do my best. Maybe one more drink first. I was visiting my friend Stu at his house in Wentzville, Missouri. He lived, alone, although there was a girl in the picture, Sophie, or maybe Sophia. Marriage was still far off, but they seemed in love. I'd come to visit him somewhat on a whim, having discussed the idea a few times, but without ever setting anything in stone. I knew he'd be free and that he'd welcome my arrival. There was no plan, really, just wanted to hang out with my friend for a day or two. I'd considered bringing my PS4, since he'd sold his months ago for a PS5, which he never managed to get, but ultimately decided to leave it behind since I only have a single controller and I didn't want to spend $60 on a second one. Sitting in his living room, we chatted for a bit, though there wasn't much to catch up on, since we'd been sharing every notable event of our lives on social media for years. After about 30 minutes of this, he asked if I wanted to go somewhere, and I said sure, and we were in his car a few seconds later. I opted to let him pick the destination, being unfamiliar with the area. Initially, we drove without a destination in mind, exiting his subdivision and getting onto the highway with the vague notion of going somewhere beyond his immediate area. After a while, maybe 5 minutes on I-70, he asked if I'd like to meet some of his friends, and I said sure. I knew enough about them to know that they were generally all right guys, since Stu had never associated with bad people. A few changes of directions later, and we were on the way to the house of a guy named Derek. Surprisingly, since Stu hadn't mentioned the distance, I found myself noting the gradual reduction of neighborhoods and businesses as we drove along. After a while, things resolved to look a bit more rural, Missouri's flavor of the boonies, I imagine, and by this point it had gotten kind of dark, enough to where the oddly placed streetlights were on and the sun on its last legs. After a staggering, cramping 3 hours, which we'd spent listening to stand-up comedy, we pulled off the highway and turned onto a street, which, after about a half mile, devolved into what I'd more accurately describe as a road, and then that diminished into a path, poorly paved and weed-eaten. Stu pulled his car into a gravelly driveway and announced that we'd arrived at Derek's house. The house was what you'd expect, being out in the parts of Missouri where people spoke with a drawl that I couldn't, and still can't, distinguish from a stereotypically southern one, even though it's my understanding that Missouri's a Midwestern state. That is to say, the house appeared to have been built more so with function in mind than aesthetic. It was a hulking thing with a chest-high porch around it. The porch's banister held a few items: clothes, towels, tarps, what might have been animal hides. It was dark, and I didn't think to take note of every object and aspect of the house. The front lawn was decently trimmed, I guess. We walked up the short flight of sturdy porch steps, and Stu knocked on the front door, opting to use his knuckles instead of the knocker in the shape of, or what might have actually been, a deer hoof. The door opened a moment or two later, with a tall man standing on the threshold, 2 liters of soda in one hand, beard dripping with orange. He smiled, wiped his face on his t-shirt, and exchanged warm greetings with Stu. My friend introduced me to his, and I threw out some random, unnecessary compliment about the man's home, which he accepted without acknowledging the awkwardness of it. He welcomed us in, and minutes later, We were all sitting in his basement, drinking soda, in my case, coffee. I listened to them retell stories they'd told to each other about themselves, only now with a bit more enthusiasm since there was another person present. The guy seemed all right, and despite the unexpected change of scenery, I felt comfortable, relaxed. That didn't last long. Derek told us, quite somberly, that he had work in the morning, so he couldn't drink, which I assumed had been Stu's general plan upon arriving, if not the reason for coming all together. Instead, we went outside and sat on Derek's back porch, I in one of the pockmarked lawn chairs he brought out of a shed. He and Stu sat on the porch itself beside me. I accepted the guest of honor position happily, since the porch seemed freely infested with a weirdly varied assortment of bugs. I'm not a fan of bugs. Neither of them seemed to mind, though, and Stu even let one curious beetle crawl up from his finger to his wrist before flicking it away. The sun had gone completely down by this point, and we were starting to feel the chill of the night when Derek told us, suddenly and almost dramatically, to be quiet. Behind the house there was a long, sprawling lawn, maybe an acre, which was huge to me, with knee-high, obviously unmaintained grass. Beyond this, there was a wall of woods, the vegetation dense to the point of having its own darkness separate from the night's. Derek's eyes were directed at this area, and upon looking at him and seeing his severe expression, Stu and I directed ours out there as well. I saw nothing, just all that wall of wood, which, in its density, seemed more like a low-flying mountain range than a collection of trees and bushes and whatever else constitutes the woods. But my ears, when directed to listen for something above the general ambiance of the night, honed in on something strange. A whisper, frantic but not irregular. The sound was rhythmic, as if spoken to a beat, and though it was obvious that the whisper noises were coming from the woods, I heard them quite audibly. The words themselves were indistinct, just beneath a level of comprehension, but the volume was loud, as if the source was nearby. I don't know how else to explain it, really. To stick with the senses for an analogy, it was like how they say you can see a lit match from a mile, or however far away at nighttime. You obviously can't feel the heat, but you can see the little flame. I couldn't make out the words, but I could clearly hear the sound. Am I making any sense? I didn't think for a second that Derek was playing with us. He hadn't known we were coming, had been in his basement with us the whole time, and lived alone. There'd be no time or opportunity for him to plan some weird prank, and he had work in the morning. Anyway, he couldn't have possibly accomplished what happened after I consciously acknowledged the sound. As if feeling the need to do something, Derek stood, and Stu and I followed suit. I thought he was going to head back inside, that he was as creeped out as I was about the weird, incomprehensible sound, but he instead strode on toward the yard, obviously meaning to investigate the noise. Stu followed due to some friendly duty of accompaniment, or his own interest in the sound. I, of course, followed, not wanting to be left alone in the dark, in the ass end of Missouri. I tried not to think of how only a thin layer of polyester separated my legs from the bug-ridden grass. I do remember thinking how the air felt fresher, cleaner, and how this made the circumstances all the weirder, because I had, by this point, began to unconsciously suspect the presence of something very strange, something deeply unnatural about the sound. Leaving the lawn, which ended a few paces short of the tree line, we stopped, brushed ourselves off, no clinging bugs somehow, and listened. The whispering was as audible as ever and as unintelligible as ever. There was definitely a rhythm to it, now made obvious by how incredibly the darkness within the woods seemed to shift, to throb with it, if you'll allow me to be a bit poetic, Imagine the entire stretch of woods, submerged underwater, and a steady current ebbing and surging through it, almost hypnotically. That's what it was like, and looking at it made me feel more than a little uneasy. I didn't want to say anything, though, for fear of coming across as jumpy to Derek. I don't know why I cared about what Derek thought. Thankfully, Stu voiced my unease, saying, "It doesn't look right." Derek nodded absent-mindedly, and I noticed for the first time the knife he'd brought, which he held in his trembling hand. I can't tell you when he drew it. Must have been upon coming face to face with that odd, pulsing darkness and feeling some powerful sense of vulnerability. I was obviously scared shitless, and I found myself feeling much better about my own fright. I don't think he intended to take that horribly fateful step. His foot seemed to rise and move forward of its own volition, his autonomy accentuated by the expression of surprise, of fearful bewilderment on Derek's face as the foot landed a foot ahead of him. That's all it took. A single step, a single gesture of approach, the suggestion of encroachment, or of invitation from the opposite side. In a mentally reeling moment, the whispers were reversed, turned into a shout, and the three of us heard, with perfect clarity, the message that had been repeating itself for minutes. "We just need one of you. Come closer. We just need one of you. Come closer. We just need one of you. Come closer. We just need one of you. Come closer." I burst into tears almost immediately. Uncontrollable, profuse crying. The sound, how could I even begin to describe it? There was a vastness, that's the most fitting word I can think of, about it. Not just in volume, but in quantity of voices. There seemed to be dozens, if not hundreds of voices, all speaking at once, perfectly at once. There is no human choir capable of performing so simultaneously. Aside from the vastness, there was an urgency about the voices, a need that terrified me. The vastness, the aching, it was all so horrible. I was scared for my life, and I hadn't even yet seen anything. Stu fainted, his mind utterly incapable of handling the bizarre phenomenon. Derek, receiving the brunt of the vocal assault, by only a few feet, mind you, started to jitter in place. I heard his teeth rattle, and a moan, low and gurgling, escaped his lips, somehow still audible against the sonic backdrop of the dreadful chant. Jesus Christ! Those were the last words Derek ever said. I don't know if it was a general acknowledgement of the circumstances, or if he'd experienced something even more heinous in his final moments, but a second later, he was pulled into the trees, into the darkness. I froze then, mid-sob, mid-sputter, mid-breath. My body just stopped working upon seeing Derek get yoinked away. A series of sounds followed. The most notable of them was a loud, prolonged tearing sound. A scream, only loosely human, accompanied it. In my petrified state, I could only listen. The scream died out before the tearing sound. That continued on for a few more seconds. What knocked me out of my terrified shock were the sounds that arose not long after. Horribly, bleakly familiar sounds. That same agonized scream, only now played through dozens, hundreds of voices. It echoed and resounded, seeming to come from multiple directions and elevations. I made a single clarifying observation. They're testing it out. Still, I wasn't yet prepared to run. I wanted to. My nerves screamed at me to, but my legs were still defrosting, the control of my limbs not yet returned to my brain. I was therefore forced to see the first manifestation, the first emissary of the voices in the darkness. It walked out from between two tightly pressed trees, and I don't think I'm embellishing what happened When I say that the trees leaned away from its figure, the thing was humanoid, and that's the nicest thing I can say about it. 2 arms, 2 legs, something that would have, in deeper darkness, passed for a head. But in that still early night, with the moon somewhere overhead, it was obvious that what or whoever had assembled this thing hadn't thought to make its outward appearance adhere to that of a human beyond the most basic form. The head was just a ball of meat, with a set of eerily shiny antlers jutting partially out of the forehead, partially from the temples, a sort of tripodal crown of bone. The face was a mask of glistening, dripping mush. The body was similarly grotesque, although certain parts seemed roughly stylized to resemble the inner musculature of a human. A tightly woven thigh muscle here, half a row of ribs or abs there. The handle of a knife, Derek's knife, jutted out from the chest, and I got the grisly impression of a knife embedded in a slab of meat on some butcher's counter. There was a smell, an animal odor, tinged with a weird sweetness that wasn't altogether unappealing. The raw nudeness of its body, its anatomical incompleteness, the obvious impossibility of natural function really touched something within me, really loosened a screw. More tears came. There were no eyes, no mouth, no nose, no ears, nothing in the way of facial features or sensory organs. Yet the thing nonetheless spoke, and this time I heard all the voices, all the obscenely inhuman speakers, focused into one loathsome voice. And this, their first words through a roughly human vessel, drove me to move, to run. You'll never be able to find joy in life, now that you've seen us. You'll never be able to find joy in life, now that you've seen us. You'll never be able to find joy in life now that you've seen me. I left Stu behind. I left him there on the grass, unconscious, 5 feet away from that nightmare. I turned heel and pathetically fled through Derek's lawn, crying, probably pissing myself. But the thing, that consolidation of horrors, didn't let me just run away. Had it been some weaker thing, a smaller choir, it might have. But there'd been so many whispers, so many, had repeated Derek's dying scream. The thing was an amalgamation of many, a legion of horrors. When I heard the steady, distinctly 4-footed trot of some large animal approaching quickly from behind, I put my heart and soul into my sprinting. I dipped my head, pumped my legs, and let my animal brain take over. Meanwhile, the more intellectual aspect of my humanity was relegated to assume control of a momentarily non-essential function, sight. It wasn't necessary to see where I was going. The path was a straight line back to the house. Turning my head, I glanced behind me, feeling an equally desperate need to get a look at the thing whose footfalls sounded like those of a horse or an enormous dog. It was, of course, neither. Thankfully, Derek hadn't offered us anything to eat. If I had food in my belly, I'm sure I would have needed to vomit at the sight of that thing, or even would have been too full to muster up that last life-saving oomph needed for my escape. It was that same abominable, ungodly creature, only now running on all fours. Its arms had lengthened to allow for terrifyingly efficient quadrupedal movement. The glistening crimson flesh flapped sickeningly. The head, crowned with an unwholesome set of antlers, bobbed hungrily. Had the thing been silent, I would have been instantly captivated by the sheer evil of it. It was an insult to human anatomy, absolutely appalling in every normal regard, but an incredible representation of some demon's infernal image. But as if to further demoralize me, the thing had thought of something new to scream at me. The moment my eyes locked onto its face, it started up again, this time calling out, "You think dead is the end of pain? You think death is the end of pain? There will be no end as long as we can put you back together. I made it to the house, tripped on the porch, banged my knees and shins in the wood, turned around, saw a single world-blotting image, a red form unspeakably textured. Felt a sharp pain in my shoulder, a sudden wave of wetness over my face and chest. Got up sometime later, dazed beyond sense. Finally entered the house, found Stu's wallet but not his keys. Walked through the house, out the front door, walked to the path, took that to the more defined road, eventually made it to the street. Walked along that for an hour or 3. Pulled a chunk of bone out of my shoulder at some point, tossed it into the field beside the road. Eventually came upon the bar where I'm sitting now. Dry on the outside, wet on the inside. I can hear sirens now. The police aren't far away. In a last, desperate attempt to get me, or some other equally spiteful reason, the thing had headbutted me, gored me in the shoulder with its twisted antlers. I don't know if the impact with a more solid form caused it to explode or if it had lost some of its integrity, having gone so far away from its place of birth. But the thing just kind of splattered against my body. I suppose I realized it unconsciously at the time. Can't imagine any other reason for my comparatively casual, half-conscious navigation through the home. So, yeah, that's the story. As much of it as I'm able and willing to tell, at least. I don't know why it happened to us tonight. I have to assume that our combined presence somehow attracted the thing, drew it out of some woodland slumber. I don't know what'll happen from here, but I can already tell that writing this out hasn't done shit. I know it'll haunt me. I can almost hear its voice whispering from the wound in my shoulder. You'll find nothing but despair in the darkness of your closed eyes.
On the verge of shitting his pants, Leonard Finch hurriedly locked the stall's door and wrenched his belt loose. "Sweet Jesus!" he exclaimed, yanking his trousers down around his ankles. His ass had barely made contact with the toilet seat when the first putrid volley came flying out. The force with which it did caused him to emit a comically loud sputter and fart. Had anyone else been in the men's room just then, Leonard was certain they would have found it impossible not to laugh. Not that Leonard really cared. The diarrhea fairy visited everyone from time to time, and when they did, it was always a noisy, smelly affair. With the initial volley having passed and the next one slowly brewing, Leonard executed a much-needed courtesy flush, then distracted himself from his toils by examining the funky collage of lewd drawings and cryptic epitaphs that covered his stall's puke-yellow interior. Out of all of it, and there was a lot, he was most impressed by the cadre of giant penises etched into the wall to his left. An artistic feat that he reckoned must have taken an incredible amount of time and effort. "Bravo, my friend," he said, as he switched his focus to the back of the stall's door, which boasted a series of random sayings inscribed in perfect block lettering, via black Sharpie by the looks of it. Sayings like, "Not my circus, not my monkey," "Bet you can't find all the cameras," "Fraudish party daily," "It'll be here soon," and "You're not as young as you used to be." Of these, Leonard found himself unusually fixated on the lattermost saying. Not because it was particularly strange or profound, it was neither, but because the subject of age had been on his mind a great deal lately. In just a few weeks' time, he'd be turning 60, a benchmark he had long associated with the start of old age. And once he crossed that stark threshold, there was no looking back, no fooling himself into believing he was at all youthful, in spirit or otherwise, something that very much hurt his soul. "Old," he said, glancing down at the spare tire around his waist. Coupled with his many liver spots and array of aching joints, It was hard not to see himself as anything but that appalling word. Sure, he still had his good points, a full head of hair and the 8-inch dangler hiding in his trousers, but it was far beyond obvious that his best days were in the rear view. If he had had any doubts about this before, the last couple of days made it pretty damn clear. Not only had he blown easy grabs at every turn, his screw-up in Cape Girardeau had nearly cost him his freedom. If that cop who had been chasing him hadn't gotten creamed by that giant dump truck. Not wanting to think about the answer, Leonard swept the notion aside and refocused himself on the task at hand. 10 minutes and one more awful volley later, he threw in the proverbial towel and commenced cleaning himself up. Once everything was good and tidy, he rinsed his hands in the restroom's filthy sink and exited the small facility. Outside, the bright summer sun beat down hard, illuminating the world in full technicolor, a welcome contrast to the restroom's drab interior. Soaking it up, Leonard slowly made his way back to the rest stop's small parking lot, which he now observed was just as deserted as it had been when he first pulled in some 20 minutes earlier. Glancing about the place, something he hadn't had time to do on the way in, it was easy to see why. Between the graffiti covering the restroom's brick exterior, the dilapidated picnic tables and unkempt grounds that clearly hadn't been tended in quite some time, the place was a genuine fucking shithole. "State tax dollars hard at work," he muttered as he approached his green Mark III van. At the driver's side door, he hesitated briefly to stretch his back and pay deference to his sciatica. "Be gentle, baby," he said, and climbed into the van. A sharp twinge arced through his hips and to his legs when he turned to sit, but as usual it faded as soon as he got himself situated. Not bad, he sighed, and fired up the van's engine. The finely tuned V6 came to life with a roar before idling down to a steady purr. Leonard patted the steering wheel. "Good girl. That's a good girl." In the vehicle's center console sat a bottle of Coke, a pack of Twizzlers, an old pair of wire-rimmed glasses, and a blister pack of 500-milligram Tylenol gel caps. Wishing he had brought his bottle of Percocets, Leonard popped out 2 of the Tylenol caps and washed them down with a splash of Coke. After a follow-on splash, he extracted 3 of the licorice sticks and switched on the AC. The compressor kicked on with a sticky hiss and struggled to get itself going. Giving it a minute, he sat back and popped one of the Twizzlers in his mouth. The ropey confection's sweet licorice flavor tantalized his taste buds and took him floating back to the summer of his 13th year, when old Unky Herb first started bringing him into the barn to educate him on the intricacies of pleasure and pain. Old Unky Herb was never without his Twizzlers, and Leonard could still recall the man's sweet breath as he entered him from behind. "Hurts a bit, doesn't it?" Herb had said the first time. "But it'll get easier, and even start to feel good. You'll see." Old Unky Herb had been right on all accounts, of course. It had hurt, a lot, and bled a lot, too. But in time, Leonard got used to it. He even came to like it. Smiling at the memory, Leonard dangled a hand over the vents. Lukewarm air trickled between his fingers. Opting to give the AC a little longer, he turned his thoughts to home and ruminated on how good it would be to get back after this latest debacle of his. Yes, get home, grab a beer. Head down into the cellar and say hi to Sonia, Dylan, and Walter. Oh, the little tykes would be disappointed in his failure to bring them a new playmate, but Leonard would make it up to them, maybe extend their time in the sunroom, or treat them to some Mickey D's. Something nice like that. Leonard felt the air again. It was cool enough now. "Atta girl," he said, and released the parking brake. He was about to shift into reverse when a loud squealing noise erupted somewhere behind Leonard. Jerking his head to the right, he peered through the passenger side window and watched in amazement as a black '66 Mustang came barreling along the rest area's off-ramp. Fishtailing precariously, the car tore a jagged path across the asphalt and disappeared behind the van. Leonard snapped his head left and resumed following the metal beast as it came to a skidding halt across 2 handicapped parking spots. "Sheesh, buddy," Leonard said. "Where's the fucking fire?" "You know the answer to that," his inner voice chimed in. "All right," he muttered, thinking of the reason he had stopped at this rest stop. "Someone's got a case of the shits." The Mustang's brake lights dimmed as the driver presumably put the vehicle in park. A few moments later, the passenger side door popped open, and, much to Leonard's surprise, a girl no older than 9 or 10 stepped into the bright sunlight. During his 60 years on Earth, Leonard had experienced a handful of instances in which time had literally seemed to stand still. The first had occurred when he was 10. At the time, he had been close friends with Danny Milner, who hailed from the impoverished Sundown Trailer Park. That summer, the two of them had found themselves in a contest of one-upmanship involving increasingly illicit "I dare yous." On the day of the time stoppage, Leonard had challenged Danny to steal an ice cream sandwich from the Circle K near the trailer park, a task he completed without issue. In response, Danny had dared Leonard to sneak into a neighbor's house and retrieve a pair of women's underwear. The house Danny had in mind belonged to a childless couple who had gone on vacation a week earlier. Deeming it an easy mark, Leonard snuck into the house's gated backyard and entered through its rear entrance, one of those sliding glass door jobs. Leaving it open, Leonard had paused to look around and get a feel for the house's interior. It was then that his eyes fell upon the living room's black couch, and the massive, frothy-mouthed Rottweiler perched upon it.
"Oh, hello there,"
he had said, keeping his tone light and jovial. The creature had responded by baring its teeth and issuing a low, prickly growl. The sound sent pangs of unease shooting through Leonard's body and soul, and the whole world seemed to stop in its tracks. Things only started back up when the dog abruptly rocketed from the couch in Leonard's direction. By some miracle, he managed to retreat outside and slide the glass door shut before the animal could rip out his throat. A couple of years after that tense encounter, Unky Herb began taking Leonard out into his barn for his special lessons. The very first occasion, time had similarly ceased functioning. It was only when old Unky Herb had decided to pull back that the seconds began to tick forward again. Likewise, as Leonard presently stared across the parking lot at the girl who stepped from the Mustang, time once again seemed to grind to a halt. During the small eternity that ensued, Leonard simply ogled the child, taking in the fact that she was actually a couple of years younger than he had initially thought, 7, 8 tops, whilst also noting how oddly she was dressed. Instead of the typical t-shirt and jeans look, she sported a vintage red and white dolly dress, white stockings, ruby red slippers, and a head full of thick pinned curls held in place by a matching red bow. "Heavens," he whispered. "She's perfect. Absolutely fucking perfect. Like a young Shirley Temple." The sentiment set Leonard's imagination alight with possibilities, the most ludicrous of which involved him stealing her away from this forlorn rest stop. Stealing her away and making her his new princess. Sonia, his current princess, had proven herself unworthy of the role, and this child was the perfect replacement. "Christ, Leo," his inner voice interjected. "Getting a little ahead of yourself, don't you think? You know you can't just snatch her right here, in broad daylight, right? With witnesses present and everything? Have you not learned your fucking lesson on this trip?" "Yeah," Leonard replied, gripping the steering wheel so tight it creaked in his palms. "I fucking have." As he said this, the girl shut the door behind her, breaking the time spell, and took a beat to take in her surroundings. Though Leonard was too far away to determine her eye color, he could tell they were actively scanning the ill-kept grounds, cinder block restroom facility, and the large clearing that lay behind it. Evidently satisfied with what she saw, the child then scampered off towards the restroom, moving with the gait so fast and awkward it made Leonard's heart swell. "I guess you're the one with the little emergency, huh?" he said, smiling at the thought. The girl reached the restroom facility within seconds. No sooner had she disappeared inside, a highly implausible thing happened. The Mustang's brake lights brightened and dimmed, and the car moved away from the curb. Leonard assumed they were just relocating to a non-handicapped parking space, but then the car kept going and took the on-ramp leading back to the highway. Wondering what the fuck they were doing, Leonard began toggling his attention between the on and off ramps. Before he knew it, a full minute had elapsed and the Mustang still hadn't reappeared. Between the 6th and 7th minutes, the girl reemerged from the restroom. Leonard noticed that she had a victorious air about her and traipsed along the sidewalk with a notable spring in her step. She was snapping her fingers too and seemed to be singing to herself. As she drew upon the empty spot where the car had been, however, her newfound jauntiness swiftly withered away, devolving into outright confusion. Her face bunched up like an old woman's and she swung her head back and forth, searching for the Mustang. Finding only the van, she scowled and transferred her gaze to the line of evergreens that stood between the rest stop and the highway. As she stared in disbelief, Leonard zeroed in on her petite mouth and discerned that her lips were moving. Curious to see if he could make out what she was saying, he lowered the driver's side window. To his dismay, the hum of it lowering pulled the girl's attention to him. She studied him momentarily, then started towards the van.
"Hey, mister,"
she shouted as she moved.
"Mister, did you see a car drive away a few seconds ago?"
Dumbfounded, Leonard struggled to articulate a coherent reply. Well, yes. Yes, ma'am, I did. It took off a few minutes ago." The girl halted about 8 feet away from the van and put her hands on her hips.
"He left? But why?"
It was a damn good question. Leonard bounced a few scenarios around in his head. Drugged-out parent, a bad joke-playing older sibling, a grandparent with Alzheimer's. But none of them washed true.
"Come on, Leo,"
his inner voice urged.
"Forget all that shit we said before. The girl's a gift from the gods. Go get her. The old snatch and trank. Better do it fast, though, before someone else shows up. Tick-tock, tick-tock." "Kinda risky," he murmured back. "Sure, but look at her. So worth it."
Leonard considered it.
"Maybe she is." "Maybe she is what?"
the girl inquired.
"Oh, nothing. I just say things sometimes and I don't know why."
For some reason, this made the girl giggle.
"Really? Me too. All the time, actually."
Leonard smiled awkwardly and changed subjects.
"Your dad, I'm sure he'll be back real soon. You want to wait here with me until he gets back?"
The girl crinkled her nose.
"My dad? No, that was Pete. And I don't think Pete is ever coming back. Nuh-uh."
"Why's that, sweetheart?" The girl shrugged.
"Just a feeling."
Her eyes suddenly went glossy with emotion, and she looked as if she were about to go Niagara on him. Somehow, though, she managed to keep it together.
"Tough little cookie,"
Leonard mused.
"That's good."
The notion ignited a warm feeling inside him, and all at once he decided to go for it. If he didn't, he'd regret it for the rest of his life, and that was no way to live. A rough plan was already forming in his head. Leonard hopped out of the van and slid the side door open. Within lay a seatless interior lined with a dark green carpet. In the very middle of it was a well-camouflaged panel that led to a small compartment where he normally stored his catches during transport. At present, the compartment was empty save for a large duffel bag, within which sat a box filled with syringes. Leonard opened the panel and retrieved a single syringe from the box.
"What you doing there, mister?"
the girl asked. Resecuring the panel, Leonard slid the syringe into his pocket and extracted a Coca-Cola bottle from the small cooler sitting behind the driver's seat.
"Just getting a cold sody pop, little lady. Such a warm day. You want one?"
Leonard held the bottle out to her. The girl regarded the beverage with a mixture of suspicion and intrigue. Well acquainted with the look, Leonard put on his most amicable smile. A critical moment was approaching, he knew. Whatever she decided about him in the next few seconds would go a long way in determining how hard or easy this would be. Her eyes danced from the bottle to Leonard's round face, then moved down, cataloging his beige polo, brown slacks, and ochre hush puppies. They lingered on his shoes before moving back to his face.
"Actually,"
she finally said, her countenance softening.
"I am thirsty, mister.
Friendly,"
Leonard told her.
"Jack Friendly. At your service."
It was the moniker he always used when trolling for newbies. It was pleasant, safe, and wholly welcoming.
Your name is Jack Friendly?"
the girl asked.
"You're a silly bee."
Leonard chuckled. He liked that, silly bee. Exactly the type of thing a princess would say.
"It is indeed. And what's your name, Curly Sue?"
The girl touched her curly locks.
"I'm called Natalie,"
she said.
Or Nat for short."
She dropped her gaze to his pelvic region.
"Hey, Mr. Friendly, what's wrong with your pants?"
Leonard glanced down and saw that his crotch was jutting out like a tent pole. To ease the jutting, he turned around and pinched one of his testicles. A sickly pain shot through his guts and resonated in his kidneys.
"It's nothing,"
he gasped, wilting.
"Just these funny clown pants."
Gritting his teeth, Leonard closed his eyes and rethought his plan.
"This is it. You can't afford to wait any longer. She's suspicious now. You need to act before it's too late."
Able to see the wisdom in this, Leonard opened his eyes and launched himself at the girl. He was fast and true, and thought for certain he had her. But the little shit managed to sidestep his advance and slip away.
"Whoa,"
she said, retreating to the curb.
"What you doing, Mr. Friendly?"
Snarling like a rabid dog, Leonard tossed the coat back into the van and made another attempt to lunge at her. Again, she evaded him, this time darting towards the restrooms. Leonard beat an angry fist against his leg.
Fuck,
he said, feeling as if he had already let the situation get away from him.
No, this is good,"
his inner voice responded.
"Think about it. If she hides in the restroom, she's trapped and you're golden. If she goes anywhere else, though, like into the woods, then it's probably time to cut and run. Wait and see."
Leonard huffed and wiped the sweat from his brow.
"All right,"
he said. After a second to steady himself, he checked the on and off ramps for any sign of traffic. Seeing none, he resumed pursuit. Natalie was almost to the facility. A few feet before reaching the entrance, she hesitated and looked back at Leonard with a wan smile. Then she ducked inside the women's room, out of sight. Rejoicing at this, Leonard upped his pace. He was almost to the doorway when a shuffling noise emanated from the ladies' room entrance. A beat later, Natalie reappeared at the doorway, eyes wide and cheeks flush. Before Leonard could think to throw himself at her, she bounded left. As she did, she reached out and touched his arm.
"You're it."
Bewildered, Leonard swung a wild fist at her head but missed badly.
"No, you little shit!"
Natalie tittered like it was all some silly game and scampered toward the side of the restroom facility. Afraid she might make a break for the woods, Leonard summoned every ounce of energy he possessed and dove at her. It wasn't the most graceful of maneuvers, but it worked. Sort of. While failing to tackle her full on, he did manage to take out her legs and send her face first into the dirt, which was something. On the downside, he wound up colliding hard with the ground too, the force of which expelled all the air from his lungs. Red-faced and gasping, Leonard immediately rolled onto his side and looked at the girl, who lay less than 5 yards away.
Didn't think I had it in me, did you?
He said.
But Mr. Friendly is full of surprises. You'll see.
Mumbling to herself, Natalie pressed a hand to her scraped chin and began to rise. To her knees first, then her feet. Drawing in a breath, Leonard reached out for her legs, eager to feel those white stockings against his palms, but the girl was too far away to reach. Seeming to realize this, she peered back at him and pointed at the woods.
Right here.
Leonard spewed a string of obscenities and hoisted himself off the ground. Natalie staggered forward and started for the trees. Her gait, however, was slow and shambling, and to Leonard's eyes it appeared as though she was favoring her left foot.
Oh,
he thought.
Did'ms hurt your footsie woodsy.
Seeming to read his mind, Natalie called out in a playful tone.
Gonna beat you, Mr. Friendly.
The taunt made Leonard snarl like the Rottweiler from his youth and cast aside all reservations about heading for the woods. If the child wanted a race, fine. He'd give her a goddamn race. As long as no John Q. Publix came along to ruin everything before the two of them reached the cover of the trees, cover Leonard now realized worked in his favor. He'd find a way to catch her and win this little battle of wills. What was it his favorite fortune cookie had said?
With determination and a little luck, all is possible.
If ever he needed this to be true, it was now.
Just take care of the luck part,
he whispered to the fates.
And I'll take care of the rest.
So saying, he culled every ounce of determination he had left and set after his new princess. The fates, it appeared, decided to go easy on Leonard. He reached a tree line without incident and improved his pace to a brisk power walk. The denseness of the wood's undergrowth prevented him from anything faster. Natalie, for her part, had also increased her pace, but only barely. Her injured foot really seemed to be hampering her. As a result, the gap between them began to shrink. Amazingly, the girl didn't seem at all fazed by this. In fact, as she staggered between the pines and saw that she was losing ground, she actually started to lob more taunts Leonard's way, saying he was too much of a fatty fat to catch her and too stupid to know when he was beat. The taunts got to Leonard at first, but soon enough he tuned them out and focused instead on what he might do to her once he got her home. His thoughts was, after weeks of funning around with her, he would cook and eat her. Not in one sitting, though. He'd do it by inches. Keep her alive as long as humanly possible.
Come on, Daddy.
Natalie laughed.
I'm still winning.
The oddness of the girl's behavior was not lost on Leonard. Given her situation, being abandoned at a desolate rest stop and having a strange man chasing her into the woods, she should have been a crying, blubbering mess. But no, she was all giggles and insults. It was almost as if she didn't really understand what was going on.
You won't be laughing soon, my dear.
Natalie looked back and stuck her tongue out. She started to hurl another taunt his way, but just then the fates elected to do Leonard a solid. The instant she uttered the first syllable, her shoulder clipped a thin birch, which threw her off kilter, and sent her twirling round and round. On the third twirl she tripped and disappeared from sight. When Leonard caught up to her, he was surprised to discover she hadn't gone into the undergrowth as he had thought. Instead, she had fallen down a ledge into a 20-foot deep gully. Her slim frame was splayed across a bunch of rocks at the bottom, and her dress was fanned out around her. Her eyes were shut. To Leonard, she looked to be dead. After a quick break to catch his breath, he used the natural drainage channel to safely navigate his way down to the gully's bottom, then hopped across a narrow brook and trotted over to where Natalie lay. The girl was breathing when he arrived, and her eyes were open and blinking. He checked her over, assessing the damage. She had a seeping gash on her forearm and a lengthy scratch down her face to match the scrape on her chin, but otherwise she seemed okay. "Alive after all," he said. "Such a tough little cookie."
What happened to me?
She asked. "You fell down, sweetie," Leonard said, squatting beside her. "But don't you worry, Mr. Friendly is here to make everything all better."
You were chasing me.
She grinned, looking at him.
We were having fun.
"Yeah, sure we were," Leonard replied.
Are you going to take care of me now?
Leonard arched his eyebrows. It was a very strange question, given the circumstances. "Why, yes I am, my lady. You're going to come home with me, and I'm going to love you plenty."
I'm not dead.
She said.
I'm awake. I'm waking.
Sure, honey," Leonard said. "Whatever you say."
Another chance.
Leonard's eyebrows dropped and a cold realization came over him. She's a freaking tard. That's what her deal is. He sighed. "Well, at least she's a pretty tard. I can work with that." "We're going to go now," he told her. "But I'm going to have to hurt you a little first." Natalie sat up. Blood oozed from the gash on her arm.
You are? But why?
Rather than use his fist to put her out, Leonard searched the vicinity for a rock. He saw one by the brook and went to retrieve it. When he came back, Natalie was standing upright, her eyes blank, her mouth agape.
It's almost to the surface, Mr. Friendly. That's why they're scared. My foster mama. My foster papa. That's why they left me. I know things now. Watch.
There was a flicker of a movement from the girl, and a rapid whooshing sound, like that of a blade being whipped across the air, and Leonard felt something brush the left side of his head. "What?" he said as a flesh-colored object plopped onto the ground in front of him.
Whoa.
The girl murmured, eyes wide with wonderment.
Neat.
Before Leonard could ask her what she meant, an icy hot wave of pain rippled across the side of his head, dropping him to his knees. He lifted a trembling hand to the site of the pain. Streamlets of red dribbled onto his palm. Aghast, he drew his hand away and watched as the warm red fluid ran down his arm and dripped onto the ground. "I'm bleeding," he said dumbly. His gaze fell upon the flesh-colored object before him. This close, there was no mistaking what it was. A human ear. "Is that mine?" he muttered. Footsteps shuffled beside him.
I'm remembering again.
Natalie said.
Little bits. It's always like this, isn't it? Like waking from a dream.
Leonard craned his head to look at her. She was standing inordinately close and had her eyes on her left hand, which floated before her like a balloon. Something was off about it. Its digits were distorted and long, each stretching the length of a bread knife. As Leonard watched, they shimmied to and fro like dancing snakes.
I dreamed I could do this,
Natalie said, leering at the malformed hand.
I had lots of bad dreams, but I don't think they're so bad anymore. Not like I thought.
The hand reshaped itself. The shimmying fingers sprouted outwards, growing longer. They turned hard and flat, like real blades. "What the fuck are you?" Leonard spat. The girl's lips spread back, revealing a mouth of reshaping teeth.
I don't know,
she said. Her mouth became a large O. She no longer looked like a child. She looked like an abomination, sent to punish him for his sins. Sensing this was the end for him, Leonard quickly reminisced over his life. Overall, it hadn't been a bad one. There had been hardship and misfortune, yes, but there had also been good times here and there. The only regret he had was that after today, nobody would be around to spend time with the little ones. No one to go down into the basement and entertain them, teach them about pain, about pleasure, about how great it is to be wanted, just like Unky Herb had done with him in the summer of. Leonard didn't quite see the hand move. He saw it shudder, heard the whoosh of air, felt the pain, but he didn't see it make the actual move that sheared off most of his face. All he briefly saw was the girl's countenance bloom with fascination afterwards, as the hunk of meat and bone that had been his nose and jaw went sailing into a nearby cluster of ferns.
"Surfacing,"
the girl whispered. A blinding flash of heat coursed through Leonard's head. Then the world went a brilliant shade of pink and Jack Friendly was no more. There was only the husk of a man that had once been Leonard Fisk, which promptly fell to the ground and became one with the forest. A time passed, then Natalie Warren emerged from the evergreens that bordered SR 87. She drifted out to the road's shoulder and faced north. The road was bright and sizzling in the afternoon sun. She surveyed its length looking for cars, but found it empty. She knew it wouldn't stay that way. Sooner or later, somebody would come and offer her a ride. She sat on the grass and brooded over what she had just done to that Mr. Friendly fellow. She had messed him up real good. Didn't even look human anymore. The animals of the forest would eat well tonight. How she had manipulated her hand like that, changing its shape, she wasn't sure. Well, that wasn't entirely true. There was a part of her, deep down but slowly rising, which knew how and why. She was changing. Of that she was certain. The change had been a long time coming, since birth. Not that she remembered much of the event. She knew she had been born and then she had gone to the orphanage. Pete and Judy Warren, her foster parents, had come and taken her when she was 2. They had raised her as their own, because Judy couldn't have kids. Living with them had been okay, she supposed. They had been nice and hadn't minded how sometimes she fell into daydreams, and suddenly came out of them screaming to the heavens about needing to set the great fire that would signal the serpent's return. She'd been having such daydreams as far back as she could remember. In them, people were always hurt and dying, and for some reason this made her happy. The death of the Homo sapiens, whatever that meant. Judy had wanted her to talk about the dreams, but Natalie didn't think it was any of Judy's business. Judy, however, kept prying and prying. She even suggested going to see a specialist, which was why a month ago Natalie had been forced to think bad thoughts and send them into Judy's brain. Pete had been the one to find Judy's body in the bathtub. She had cut her wrists, and Pete had cried like a baby. Since then, he hadn't talked much to Natalie, just stared at her with strange eyes. Natalie knew he had grown frightened of her, just as all her classmates at Buford Elementary had after she whispered into Mikey Bozeman's ear, and he ended up jumping off the school's roof. Then came this trip to see Pete's mother in Memphis. Pete had been jittery since Judy's funeral and said he needed to visit with family for a while. When they got in the car to leave, Natalie had sensed something hovering about him. Because of it, she made him promise not to leave her, not until she was ready, whatever that meant. Pete had said sure, but he obviously hadn't meant it. He had abandoned her at the first chance he got. She should have expected it, she realized now. People were more intuitive than they seemed. They were smart and devious. They were the reason her kind had been divided so long, and that was why they all had to burn. If none of them were left, then there would be nothing to fight over, and everything could go back to the way it was, whatever that meant. Natalie stood and blinked her eyes. She thought she saw a glimmer in the distance. She hoped it was a car. The urge to leave this place and move on was more overwhelming than it had ever been. She felt the need to be around lots of people, the lower sort of people to begin with, the homeless, the dirty, the ones like Mr. Friendly, who would help start the fire. Perhaps this time things would be different. Perhaps this time nothing would stop her. Natalie squinted at the approaching glimmer. It was a car. A large one, maybe a truck.
Goody,
She said, and stuck out her thumb.
Kept company by a lone street lamp's flickering cone of light, Donovan Clark and Ellen Cruz reviewed the facts. Unlike many of their cases, this one seemed positively packed with substance. The leads were strong, the accounts were corroborated, and the net of skepticism seemed to have been pinched adequately tight. There was next to no denying what they were dealing with this time. That did nothing to soothe their unease, however. "Steady," Clark muttered, adjusting the GoPro mounted to the roof of their van. He pressed down on the record button. The single chipper beep sounded piercing in the enclosed space. "All right, leave some room for a clean cut. 3, 2, 1. We're on location in the heartland of Louisiana. Let's review the confirmed cases before we head out," said Clark, pretending as though they hadn't rehearsed the exchange 3 times before. Richard Blair, a wealthy stockbroker passing through the area on the way to his next meeting, decides to spend the night at St. Peter's Rock, a boarding house off of 32nd and Beach. He wakes up the next morning to find... Clark shifted through his notes with a dramatic pause. Worn stumps where his fingertips used to be, and all 10 of his nails embedded in the wall to his left. To his right, sitting at the table with him, Cruz winced, flexing her own fingers against her palms. It was the 4th time she had heard him repeat that phrase, yet it still made her recoil. Clark seemed not to notice or care. She could have been playing up the tension of the moment for all he knew. Doctors at the ICU attributed it to psychotic somnambulism, Clark continued. Fair enough, but they'll have a harder time explaining the case of Trevor Chastain, a homeless man who'd managed himself a warm bed at St. Peter's Rock. He brandished a glossy photograph from the stack of papers. Little did he know, that would be the last time he'd lay his head down for the night. They had planned on blurring most of the photograph in post, but Cruz still had to look away. The victim in the picture was nude, the remnants of his clothing shredded and soaked in his blood. His dark skin was flared red with wicked slash wounds in the shape of inverted crosses. But it was his face that disturbed them the most. His eyes were wide and glazed, frozen with death, and his mouth had almost contorted open in what could have only been a scream of the damned. One could see halfway down his throat, which glistened from the flash of the camera. "Seems no one is spared at St. Peter's Rock," Cruz remarked once the photo had been stashed away. "Who, or whatever this is, doesn't care if you're rich, poor, black, or white, or purple." And according to another eyewitness, Clark followed, goaded by her remark, whether or not you stay at the boarding house doesn't matter either. His next excerpt was a clipping from a newspaper. Take Margaret Holmes. Spent the weekend at St. Peter's Rock, then woke up the first morning at her own home to find drawers pulled open, mirrors smashed, and her kitten's cold corpse dangling from its neck underneath the ceiling fan. It followed her back, said Cruz. Followed her back, latched on, cursed her, whichever you prefer, Clark responded, slipping the papers back into an envelope. Regardless, this Louisiana boarding house seems to be a hotspot for some of the most violent paranormal activity we have ever heard of. It's very likely taking this on could be a one-way trip for both of us. If we go in, there's a good chance something might come out with us. Donovan, wait, Cruz interrupted. Clark let out a frustrated sigh, pounding a fist on the table. For God's sake, Ellen! He reached up and cut the GoPro. What did I say about waiting until the take is over? This time it's merited, Cruz responded, her brow lowering. We don't have all night, Clark seethed. This might be our last chance to get a good cold open before we arrive on location. Yes, that's what I'm concerned about, said Cruz. Since when did we adopt this one-way trip, final destination kind of angle? You're making this sound like a suicide mission. It makes for good drama, said Clark. And let's be real here, we have to be aware of the risks with this one. You saw the reports. You saw the pictures. Whatever this is, it's mean and ugly as hell. Literally. Okay, I get it, but this is... Cruz hesitated, trying to find the right words. Different. This is like actual murder we're dealing with. I'm just questioning whether the direction we're going with this is appropriate. Clark surveyed her for a moment. Then his face softened, but a glimmer lingered in his eyes. You're scared, aren't you? Cruz, by contrast, hardened her expression and looked directly at him. I've crept through abandoned mental hospitals, graveyards, warehouses, and sewer systems working with you. I've seen things I can't explain working with you. But nothing in all those months has ever gotten under my skin, Donovan. This, however? Yes. Fuck it, I'm scared. She crossed her arms, turning away. And frankly, I think the way you want this to go down is cavalier. Hell, I might even say misguided. Okay, so how do you reckon we should go about this? Maybe with a little more tact, she said. Let's just treat this like a normal investigation. Rushing in, spouting about one-way trips might invoke something like an actual one-way trip. Clark gave a half smile, readjusting the GoPro. You've got a good heart, Ellen. But good hearts didn't get us this far. Cruz sighed. Their show, The Halfway, didn't reach the scope and scale of the more popular paranormal TV shows, but it had amassed a large enough online following for them to both be self-sufficient. Its impressive growth could only be attributed to Clark's cutthroat business and marketing tactics. And the visual aspect doesn't hurt either, she rued, reflecting on one of Clark's comments to her halfway through their first season. I wouldn't watch it if it was my ugly face plastered on screen. So whatever you do not grow out of those tight little tops. We're at our season finale, Clark was saying, and we're taking a brief hiatus once this episode goes up. What better way to rack up suspense than going to a place that might not be done with us once we're gone? Ten cuidado con lo que deseas, Cruz whispered. Clark looked up at her with a pointed gaze. What was that? Something my mother used to tell me, said Cruz, turning away. Good advice by my reckoning. He regarded her briefly and shook his head with another smile. Okay. Let's keep it in English for the cold open. Sound good? She only grimaced and wrung her hands together as he reached out to the GoPro again. Room for a clean cut. 3, 2, 1. The early morning sky was green by the time their van pulled into the boarding house's parking lot. St. Peter's Rock was a staggering black monolith, backlit by the scant eastern glow. 2 lone lamps illuminated windows among the structure's 4 stories, resembling a mismatched pair of eyes. The van idled in place as the 2 readied their intro piece. St. Peter's Rock, Clark narrated, a cultural icon in the Louisiana heartland, historically a popular gathering point for Mardi Gras partygoers since the late 1800s. But, as of late, it served as a playground for a particularly bloodthirsty presence. Crews followed, begrudgingly sticking to the script they had rehearsed on the drive over. Because of the attacks, traffic to the boarding house has absolutely plummeted, said Clark. The landlord is despondent. The building has been her life for decades at this point, and she would hate to see its reputation take one final fall to hell. He pointed his finger back and forth between Cruz and himself, another move they had rehearsed. If we can not only figure out who or what is menacing St. Peter's Rock, but also banish it for good, we could potentially save the landlord's business and bring the lodgers back for years to come. He held out his hand and stared expectantly at Cruz. She stared back, a small novel's worth of comebacks coursing through her head. Their signature handshake, a staple of their show's intro, more than ever felt hackneyed and inappropriate. But the corner of Clark's lip twitched, and she followed through and recited her typical line. "We'll meet them at the halfway." Clark finished the line, "And pray we find our way back." He reached out and cut the cameras. "Listen," he said. "I know you're upset." Cruz waited for him to finish his thought. After a moment, she raised her eyebrows. "And what?" Clark shouldered a bag of camera gear. "And nothing. Keep it to yourself, at least until the filming's done. That isn't too much to ask, is it?" Cruz seethed silently at him, but she hoisted another gear bag and threw the side door open. She stumbled at the sight of the building towering over them. The sun had risen slightly more. A halo of weak dawn yellow blazed around it in a semicircle. "That's fucking scary, isn't it?" said Clark, drawing next to her and peering up at it with awe. "We definitely gotta get some B-roll before everything becomes too bright." They unpacked a tripod and mounted one of their black magics. "You think this is freaky now? Just think back to those photos, Ellen. Steel your nerves." "You'll need them." A cold breeze kicked through the air, forcing a shiver out of Cruz. Clark adjusted the camera's aperture and panned slowly across the building's face. As he acquired his shots, Cruz glanced at the sunrise with a glimmer of relief. This early in the morning, its progress up the horizon was visible to the naked eye. She closed her eyes, breathing in a lungful of bracing air. She had a nasty feeling she should savor whatever sunlight she could before stepping inside the building. The lobby was gray from the early morning light in a dusty shroud of sullenness. Antiquated pillars rose to the checkered ceiling, whose immaculate patterning was broken by thin, branching cracks. Dark oakwood furniture lined the far walls, and apart from a scattering of mahogany placemats, the concrete floor was barren and cold. Noises from the floors above caught Clark and Cruz's attention, of shuffling footsteps and squeaky faucets. Clark threw a scrutinous gaze upward. "There are still lodgers here?"
"Just the regulars,"
a scratchy voice called from another room. Clark and Cruz turned to the source. Lingering in a doorway was a middle-aged woman with a mane of red hair, toting a little cigarette between her fingers. Her eyes were heavy with mascara and fatigue. She offered a ruby-colored smile as she walked towards them, a trail of smoke in her wake. Clark signaled to Cruz, who positioned the camera and began rolling. "Good morning," he said, approaching the woman. "I'm Donovan Clark, with The Halfway, and I presume you are Abigail Stone, the landlord?"
"That's landlady to you,"
said Stone, ignoring Clark's outstretched hand.
"And yes, I've overseen this place for the last 3 years, through thick and thin, storm and sun."
"So, who else is here?" Cruz prompted. Stone shook her head. Poor, sorry wanderers. They got nowhere else to go, so I've taken them in. They don't pay the bills, of course, she added with a long drag. Hell, they couldn't pay attention. They ain't got a penny to their names. But you know what? She pointed emphatically with her cigarette. A few ashy remnants fell to the floor. It's the right thing to do. Oh, bless their souls. And they're here despite all that's happened? Said Clark. Stone gave a sympathetic smirk. They're playing the odds, and who am I to turn them away? And all the while, I'm doing my best to give them a warm, welcoming place to stay. She sighed, shaking her head again. So sad. They need all the love they can get. Only I can give it to them. That's mighty noble of you, said Clark, offering his showman's smile. Perhaps we should move this to the front office for a more formal interview. Oh, of course, she said in a smoldering tone. When all is said and done, this ain't a social visit. She winked before turning and heading back for the doorway she came from. Clark and Cruz looked at each other. The same thought seemed to reverberate between them. This lady's the real anomaly. Once they had migrated to the front office, the two erected a typical interview setup and positioned Stone at her desk with Clark sitting across from her. Let's start out with a recap of all that's happened, he said. Back to the beginning. What was the first thing you noticed? Stone sighed, lighting up a fresh cigarette. Well, the first instance was about 2.5 years ago. There was this god-awful smell coming from the vents. Now, my first thought was that something crawled in there and died. If I'd put my money on it, I'd have said it was a possum. You ever smell one of them dead? Like, actually dead? I had one under my crawl space when I was a little girl, and my God, it could have made the devil tear up. She blew a puff of smoke through her nose with a strained smile. Then we realized it was coming from everywhere, and despite there being no dead things, there were maggots. Piles of them just appearing, like how they appear on cuts of meat. Like this whole place and everything in it was a cut of meat. She leaned forward, her eyes yellow and watery. Y'all know what it's like to wake up with a hole in your arm, crawling with the disgusting little things. You know what it feels like to have dozens of tiny little mouths nipping away under your skin? Clark nodded, his gaze averted. Cruz, manning the camera, twitched as a shudder ran through her body. It seemed to take a moment for Clark to regain his bearings. And things have only escalated from there? I'm sure you've seen the articles, Stone confirmed with a glare. People have died here since. They've been mutilated, traumatized, what have you. He strikes at random, without prejudice, in all his cruelty. Excuse me? Said Clark, doing a double take. He? You know what this entity is? At this, Stone actually laughed out loud. Oh, hell, it couldn't be more obvious to me. Gregory Trent. A hushed silence roared in the room. Clark side-eyed Cruz, who gave an imperceptible shrug. Never had one of their investigations yielded solid answers so early on. He was a landlord before me, Stone continued. Miserable son of a bitch went and drowned in the bathtub, and I had to step up to fill the gap. I reckon he's not done here. I reckon he feels unfulfilled, like he had unfinished business or something. I can't imagine what, other than getting past third base with that Brazilian housekeeper. She raised her voice and shouted at thin air. You hear that? She left! You goddamn sicko! Get over it! So you don't seem too fond of him, said Clark, trying to reorient the conversation. What was he like in life?
Real cast-iron bastard,
Stone snapped.
Narcissistic, bipolar, neurotic head case. Here's his meds.
She opened a drawer and pulled out a white plastic bottle, rattling it for emphasis.
Everyone here hated him. But he gave them the roof over their heads, so what could they do?
She shut the drawer with a snap that made Cruz jump.
He's the one doing it. Death apparently didn't stop him from continuing to make everyone else's lives horrible. He's ruining my business, my reputation, and he's hurting innocent people.
She leaned forward again.
Please, help us put this evil to rest.
It was Clark's turn to lean forward. Ma'am, we are more than capable of dealing with the supernatural. We've overseen exorcisms, we participated in cleansings. Anything the other side has to offer, we've gone and dished it right back. Once, over in Mongolia, we even chased a Yeti out of a yak processing plant.
Allegedly,
Cruz corrected. Clark closed his eyes.
Allegedly.
That's off the record, by the way, Ellen. But our repertoire is near unmatched in our field. Once we figure out exactly what we're dealing with, we can take the next steps in sending Gregory Trent back where he belongs. The other side. Stone nodded, slumping in her chair with a smoky grin.
Very good. Well, I'll let you two get on your way.
She winked again.
I'll be sitting right here if you need anything at all.
A nervous smirk crossed Clark's face. We'll definitely keep that in mind. Thank you for your help. As they broke down the cameras and mics, however, Clark and Cruz shared another knowing expression. And we'll stay far away. That's for sure. They set up their base of operations in room 225, the location of the most recently reported incident, where a passing drifter lifted her sheets one morning to find her midsection caked with swollen blisters, Clark explained to the camera. She had to be hospitalized due to blood poisoning from the sheer amount of pus. The physicians attributed it to a severe allergic reaction. But, considering Gregory Trent's rather voracious, carnal attractions, as we've learned, we cannot rule out. He paused, as if the impending word tasted sour. Assault. Clark wiped his face, then proceeded after a brief pause. The stakes for this investigation just rose to dire levels. This has elevated to... He hesitated again, then he turned away and held out his palm. Cut the video. Cruz lowered the camera.
You sound like overwhelmed.
I guess the weight of it all just hit me mid-take, said Clark. We'll redo it once I get a solid line down. Cruz said with a nod.
It's all horrible, isn't it? Is it making you reconsider your approach?
Absolutely not, Clark said sharply, emptying a case to distract himself. We have a name and all the necessary connections. With these things, that's half the battle. He took out one of the EVP detectors, a brick-shaped audio recorder adorned with dials and knobs. But how about that Abigail Stone? I say we make our Season 3 pilot about her.
She's definitely a rare bird,
said Cruz. Overbearing is the word, Clark mused, priming the detector. Always has to get a word in.
Kinda reminds me of someone I know,
Cruz muttered. Clark sent the detector down on the bed. What did I say about keeping the attitude to a minimum until we're done here?
This is a minimum,
Cruz quipped. Clark stammered, then rolled his eyes with a breathy laugh. Good one. But I'm not paying you to make smart-ass remarks, Ellen. You can find work elsewhere if that's what you want. At this, Cruz reached over and grabbed Clark's shoulders. They jumped, as if electrocuted, but Cruz's eyes were like lightning themselves. "I am begging you, Donovan Clark, do not provoke whatever's here. I know you're jacking up the drama or whatever, but nothing good will come from it. I just know it. We are in deep enough already. We don't need to invite this entity's wrath." Clark's eyes glazed for a split second. Then he gently lifted her hands off of his shoulders. "Ellen, honey, this is the last I want to hear of this." He stepped back, seeming confused at her indignant expression. "We are going to do this the way I prescribe. We have beats, we have leads, we have content." A manic flash crossed his face. "We are making waves with this investigation already, and I won't have your narrow sentimentality drag us down." Cruz was speechless, but Clark was a man possessed, now rummaging through the room, closing blinds and rearranging furniture. "Now, let's set the scene. Maybe turn on night vision to sell the creep factor. Our first step will be attempting to make contact with Gregory Trent." Regardless, Cruz sealed her lips and went about conveying his orders. But, unbeknownst to him, her heart had sealed too. "I hope this episode turns out real damn good," she thought. "Because after it airs, you won't have me to help ever again." With the intro finally complete, and with the room viewed through a filter of infrared green, Clark and Cruz are ready to contact Gregory Trent. Absolute silence, Clark muttered as he readied the EVP detector. As if spurned by his words, the bedroom sank into a stifling vacuum devoid of sound. The blood rushing in their ears was like a distant ocean. Clark raised the detector above his head. His soft intake of breath was a roar in the dead silence. "We call upon the spirit of Gregory Trent. We ask that you give us a sign of your presence." A gravid moment ticked by. Clark's eyes, gleaming white marbles through the infrared, flickered around the room. "Is there anyone here with us?" he prompted. Still, silence. "Give us a sign of your presence," he demanded. A bulb in the detector lit up. The needle on its miniature dashboard swung 3/4 of the way across and wobbled precariously in place. Clark wheeled his gaze into the camera and mouthed wordless excitement, jabbing his finger at the detector. "This is unprecedented," he whispered, holding up the detector whose needle remained jumpy. "These readings are sustained. Gregory Trent really wants to tell us something." Cruz was astonished as she panned the camera around the room, hoping to pick up a visual indicator. After 30 seconds, the needle dropped to the corner mark. "Yes," Clark gasped. "Let's play back the recordings." He pulled out a laptop from the case, throwing it open and stringing a USB cable from the machine to the detector. Cruz held on the screen with bated breath as it booted up. "Now," Clark declared, opening up the detector's audio file. "Let's hear what you have to say." The static blared for a moment. Then, muted but clear, a man's voice broke through the noise. "This is Jeopardy! Here are today's contestants." "What?" Clark spat as garbled fanfare rang from the speakers. Sure enough, Alex Trebek began listing off contestants' biographies just like the show's intro. A lodger must have turned his TV on. God damn it! Cut the film, cut the film! Cruz lowered the camera, her chest aching from trying not to laugh. Clark set the detector down and snapped the laptop shut. Goddamn boarding house fucks. Come on, Ellen. We have to find out whoever that is. Donovan, chill out, Ellen chided, but she failed to hide the warble of laughter in her voice. Clark was not amused. Give me the camera, he growled before snatching it from her grasp. I'll go by myself. I don't need you nagging down my back about… His ranting was cut off as he stormed out the door down the hallway. Cruz sighed. Hopeless, she muttered, walking towards a door that led to the bathroom. That man's going to sabotage his own season finale, not me. She flicked on the light and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Something's not right, she thought, running a hand through her long, dark hair. We dove too deep and missed the mark. We need to restructure this approach. She ran her hands under the faucet, taking a casual glance up at the mirror. Her reflection's hand was still in its hair. Cruz blinked, backing away into the wall. The reflection remained still, its blank eyes locked on its real-world double. It smiled broadly, its fingers curled, and with a strenuous pull, ripped a lock of hair from its head. Its teeth bared and its eyes widened as it tore away more hair. As Cruz watched, transfixed and horrified, its pale, bleeding scalp came into view amid a black rain of hair, and the thing screamed soundlessly and banged its fists against the mirror, again producing no noise. The glass cracked from the inside. Its anguished shriek finally exploded through, slamming Cruz to the floor. The light pulsated, and blood oozed from the cracks. The bathroom went black. Something metallic and hollow clanged at the floor, which finally jolted a scream out of Cruz. Then the lights came on. Cruz's reflection was her own, hair and all, her ghastly expression distorted by the prismatic mirror and dried blood, which had darkened to the point of seeming ancient. Holy fuck, she wheezed, a hand over her heart. It had all happened so fast, yet it was the most bold-faced instance of paranormal activity she had seen in 2 years of the halfway. The dingy little bathroom suddenly took on an ominous air. The walls seemed to have eyes, and the air felt heavy with deathly spirits. A new voice welled up. It reverberated and seemed to rise through a compressed space. An itch flared under Cruz's skin as she turned her head to its source. The shower. Oh God, she whispered. The drain. Something was speaking through the drain. She considered scrambling back to the bedroom and grabbing the EVP detector, but the voice was already quieting. Forcing life back into her muscles, she crawled to the bathtub and peeked over the rim. The drain was coated with rust, but otherwise seemed innocuous. She caught one lone phrase that seemed to trickle away like running water. Trapped me. Cruz scooted away, her hand over her heart again. The words rattled in her skull, dredging up a blackish dread from her core. Whatever evidence they had found in prior episodes had been at most shaky, but she had seen enough horror fiction to piece together a plausible explanation. An infestation, she concluded. She looked up at the broken mirror. Those two weren't the same. It's not just Gregory Trent here. A third voice sounded off, this time from above. It was more familiar to Cruz. Clark had apparently found the TV watcher. I have to get him, Cruz realized, heading for the bathroom door. She half expected a grotesque, rotting hand to reach out and snag her shoulder, dragging her to the bathtub where she'd be forced down the drain one agonizing inch at a time. But the bathroom, it seemed, was done with her. It was easy to track Clark's voice up one story and down two connecting hallways. "Integrity of the investigation!" Clark was shouting. "You must turn it off!" The voice that responded was indignant. "I don't know who the hell you think you are, waltzing in here and telling me what to do." "Oh dear," Cruz said as she quickened her pace down the hall. "You knew we were coming! The landlord informed you!" Clark retorted. "Take it up with Miss Stone, then!" The lodger cackled as Cruz found the open door and invited herself in. Clark was standing at the foot of the bed, fists clenched at an old man dressed in rags reclining upon it. "But I want to watch Jeopardy!" he protested, gesturing at the television screen. "At least turn it down," Clark seethed. The old man cupped his hand to his ear. "Was that? Turn it down!" "Ha! Can't hear squat if I ain't jacking up the volume. Sorry, young man." "Donovan," Cruz said sternly, "I need you back in the room." "Yeah, you listen to her and get out," the old man berated. But his sultry expression upon seeing Cruz told her he didn't care if she stayed. "Come on," Cruz urged, striding over and grabbing Clark's wrist. "You fucking codger," Clark hissed, but he backed off, and the two exited the bedroom. The Jeopardy! Time's Up tone played as Clark slammed the door shut. "Miserable wretch," Clark muttered. "Well, while you were up here harassing homeless people," said Cruz, "I got confronted by an actual evil entity in our room." Clark wheeled around to her. "What?" "It..." Cruz couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. The fear had crept back in. "Just come look." After navigating through the hallways, they were back in their room. Clark entered the bathroom and stared in awe at the cracked, bloody mirror. "You said your reflection did this?" "Yes," Cruz confirmed, her voice weak. "And I heard something speaking through the shower drain. It said something had tracked it." Clark walked over to the bathtub and examined it in silence. "Something tells me those two were not connected," he finally said. "Even for manic spirits, scaring the shit out of you and then calling for help doesn't seem logical. Those were two distinct expressions." "My thoughts exactly," said Cruz. "Let's get some cover shots of the mirror," said Clark. "And I know your heart isn't in this like mine is, but for God's sake, next time you go somewhere on your own, bring a camera." "Whatever," Cruz replied, rolling her eyes. "Just a few more hours of him," she told herself. They migrated their equipment to the bathroom despite its cramped accommodations. They then killed the lights and filmed their cover shots, once again necessitating the infrared filter. "We turned to the bathroom to find something cracked this mirror and made it seep blood," Clark explained. Cruz, holding the camera, had to bite her tongue. It was another instance of Clark's creative liberties for narrative streamlining. "Whether this is Gregory Trent's spirit or something else entirely, we're not sure," he continued. "But we're going to try the EVP detector in the bathroom and set up camera traps. Whatever did this might be grounded to this particular room. Who knows what tragedy transpired here?" Taking another calming breath, he readied the detector and aimed it at the mirror. The cracks in the glass reflected multiple green, glowing-eyed Clarks staring back at him. "Send us another sign of your presence," he called out. The enclosed room seemed to suck his voice into nothingness. The silence that followed was catastrophic. "Gregory Trent!" he beckoned. "Why are you holding these spirits hostage?" Cruz lowered the camera. Hold up. How do you know Gregory Trent's trapping spirits? Clark held out his palm, obscuring the lens. You heard Abigail Stone. He was an evil, psychopathic bastard inflicting his abuse upon others, even in death. He lowered his hand and shouted at the ceiling. Your trick's out, Trent! Show yourself! We want to see your sorry face! Just as he said it, Cruz's camera exploded. There was a brief flash of electric light that seared their eyes, then a puff of acrid fumes and a sizzling crawl down her hands. Cruz screamed and pushed past Clark to the faucet. As she ran her hands through the faucet, Clark turned on a flashlight, which swallowed the room in a harsh bluish-white glow. The EVP detector was going haywire. The needle jumped back and forth like windshield wipers. The other two cameras had melted, their lenses collapsing in on themselves. The burnt plastic odor was overwhelming, and scrawled on the walls, trailing ribbons of paint to the floor, was one phrase repeated over and over again. Find me. Oh, are you getting this? Clark yelped, swinging the beam around. He looked at the melted cameras and cursed. So much shit happening right now. Oh, fuck me! He exploded out of the room and fumbled through his equipment bag for a spare camera. Alan, grab a camera and follow me! Cruz, breaking herself from a stupor, followed him into the bedroom and grabbed a spare camcorder from the bag. Clark threw the bedroom door open and his footsteps crunched as if he had trampled over eggshells. The hallway lights illuminated a writhing colony of cockroaches clustered at the foot of the door. The carpet splattered pale yellow with insect guts as Clark jumped like he had trodden on lava. Cruz halted at the doorway upon seeing them, cringing and nearly vomiting on the spot. Jesus fucking Christ! Clark cried, scooting away and filming the trampled mess of bugs. What? No! Oh, you gotta be shitting me! He bellowed, sprinting down the hallway. Cruz shakily raised the camera, viewing the carnage through the LCD screen, and gasped at the sight. Where the splattered remains were was an amorphous blob of dead pixels. No, don't do this. No, don't do this, not now. Come back here! Clark's voice exploded. Cruz cursed and vaulted over the cockroaches, stopping herself against the opposite wall and pushed off with a cry of disgust. The walls pulsated with meaty veins that bulged in and out of being, twisting and nodding into the words, "Find me." Dios mío, Cruz stammered, crossing herself. It was the first time in over 2 decades she had invoked God's name out of a plea. But as the Venus walls around her continued to fester, she somehow knew God could not help them now. Ellen! Clark shouted from the far end of the throbbing hallway. Film what you can and follow me! He ran out of sight and Ellen followed. I see him! Clark declared from around the corner. Ellen! I see Trent! In the elevator! What? Cruz caught up with him and stared down the corridor. At the end was a service elevator whose doors were jammed halfway open. Standing inside it was a balding, shadowy man with pale, watery skin. Even from a distance, Cruz could tell he wasn't there, in the corporeal sense. The specter's eyes were empty holes in its pallid skull. Words were scrawled in the elevator wall behind him. They were obscured, but Cruz could tell what they said. Found me. Gregory Trent? Come out! Clark demanded, walking towards him. Donovan, are you insane? Cruz hissed. Her camera registered a manic Clark striding down a corrupted hallway towards a veritable portal of dead pixels. Don't do this! Stop! She cried. Inside the elevator, the specter smiled and waved goodbye as the doors began to close. Oh, no, you don't, said Clark, setting his camera down and sprinting for them. With Cruz on his tail, He grabbed the doors as they touched shut and threw them open once more. "Shit!" he cried, swinging his arms in circles and meandering forward. Cruz grabbed his shirt collar and heaved with all her might. Clark lingered with imbalance for a heart-stopping instant, then stumbled and fell backwards. "Holy fuck," he wheezed, staring at what was only a second earlier a solid elevator, now an empty shaft, plummeting into perpetual darkness. Ellen approached the edge and looked down, aiming the camera. Then she looked up and went still with sheer horror. Protruding from the ceiling was a cavernous maw, bristling with human teeth. A ropey tongue descended from its throat, forming a fleshy noose that assimilated with the neck of the man they had just seen in the elevator. Even from Cruz's fleeting mental snapshot, she noticed the man's colors and finer details fading away until it was a featureless cadaver dangling from the mouth demon's tongue. The beast reeled its lure back into its throat, grumbling with disappointment and hunger. Cruz inched away from the shaft and fell to her knees, a balloon swelling in her throat. The urge to scream had liquefied into tears that ran freely down her cheeks. Drawing in her breath became agony. Her mind felt centimeters from exploding. "Where's the camera, Ellen?" said Clark. His voice was a muted whine to her. "Damn it, Ellen, where is the camera you were holding?" Ellen only gazed blearily at her burned, empty hands. Clark looked past her, down the elevator shaft. "You dropped it down there, didn't you?" he said. There was a dangerous tremor in his tone. "You actually dropped it, for fuck's sake. You. No word was good enough, apparently. He merely scooped up the camera he had set down. At least this was recording. Damn! All these dead pixels, though. I know our audience trusts us, but this still won't look good. I'm done, Cruz managed. Clark blinked as if he'd misheard. Excuse me? There's horrible darkness here, Cruz muttered. She slowly rose to her feet. This is beyond any of our capabilities. We were idiots to think we could tackle it. Ellen, there is still work to be done, Clark said. Trent's spirit is still at large. We got him to reveal himself. That wasn't Trent, Cruz snapped. You don't know what I saw up there. You don't know anything about this. And yet you're tearing through here, nearly getting yourself killed because you think you're this hotshot ghost hunter. Ellen? For the last time, said Cruz, her eyes watering again. Drop this madness. You have dug yourself into a hole, and we need to get out before the worst happens. Clark's voice was a steely calm. You're going to abandon this investigation right smack in the heat of things? We've come so far. We have seen things today that would have made weaker men into blubbering retards. This is what makes us stand out among the posers, Ellen. His tone took on an edge. There are things in this world beyond our comprehension that scoff at our attempts to do so. We are the only ones who can bring them into the light. It is our sworn duty. And you want to flake on me? Cruz nodded. Yes, I do. Clark gaped at her for a wrenching moment. Then he nodded. All right, get out of here then. I guess this is a closed set after all. Gladly, Cruz retorted, turning heel and storming off. As she turned the corner down to the hall where the room was, she heard Clark's narrator voice from behind her. In a stunning development, my partner Ellen Cruz has decided to leave the show due to a sudden and, quite frankly, rather unexpected bout of fearfulness. The rest of the investigation will be carried out by myself alone, as I continue pushing forward to "Cabron," Cruz whispered as she burst their room door open. I am not fearful. I just know my limits. But as she shambled into the bathroom, regarding her shattered reflection in the mirror, she thought back to the previous victims. Carved up, assaulted, a few murdered. The hearing-impaired homeless old man who had lucked out with a warm bed and reruns of game shows. The countless, nameless others who'd endured an infested boarding house. They knew exactly what they were up against, and yet they wound up there anyway for a place to sleep. They apparently knew their limits. They apparently had enough faith to test them. The giant maw in the ceiling returned to her mind, but this time it spoke to her in Clark's voice. We've seen things that would have made weaker men into blubbering retards. You mean I've seen things, Cruz corrected. You, on the other hand, have seen nothing. And you certainly won't now, especially without me. Her fingers closed on the rim of the sink. I do know my limits, she realized. My limits allow me to deal with this myself. My way. Cruz ran the faucet and splashed water over her face. Cool logic seeped in where hot temper once flared. What do you know? She asked herself. Gregory Trent, the previous landlord, abusive, mentally insane, died 3 years ago, inflicting suffering upon the living even to this day. She looked up. The thing in the mirror, then around her, the beast that tried luring us to our deaths. She noticed to her morbid amusement that the scratched words in the walls behind her now read, "Found me." "Trapped," a distant voice wailed. Cruz jolted, remembering the other occurrence. The voice in the drain had called out again, the entity that had claimed to be trapped. She approached the bathtub, then paused. What if it were another demon, posing as a suffering soul to try and draw her in? The thing in the mirror that had mimicked her reflection might just as easily mimic a man's voice. She waited a solid minute. In the silence, her sense of hearing seemed to sharpen. "Help me." She turned her head. This time, the voice sounded less contained, like it was coming from two places at once. Still from the drain, but somewhere else as well. Cruz strode from the bathroom out into the hallway. Ignoring the perforations on the wall, she crossed over to another room and let herself in. Thankfully, it was vacant when she immediately entered its bathroom and quieted herself, listening out. As the moments crawled on, she found herself inching closer to the shower. "Trapped me," the ghostly voice repeated. She took a shaky breath. Whatever it was not confined to their bathroom alone. Its voice was reverberating through the plumbing. Anyone, anywhere in the building could have potentially heard it, including Abigail Stone, Cruz realized. With her eyes and ears all around the building's business, she surely would have noticed the sepulchral cries throughout the various bathrooms and pipes. It seemed like a significant detail to account for among all the raw horror she and the lodgers had endured. But during their brief interview, Stone had only seemed to talk about Gregory Trent, and how horrible he was. Cruz didn't doubt her then, and she still didn't now. But then again, Cruz's knocking outside the landlord office door was met with silence. She frowned, remembering Stone's promise that she'd be there if they needed anything at all. Her frown deepened as she thought back to all that had transpired on the second floor. Surprised she hadn't come up to check on what was going on. Is she even still in the building? Cruz knocked again, and again. Nothing responded. Closing her eyes and composing herself, Cruz grabbed the door handle and twisted it open. Just as she suspected, the room was empty. The chair behind Stone's desk was neatly pushed in. Nothing around the office seemed scattered or misplaced. Stone could have simply disappeared for all Cruz knew. It was then she noticed a second door in the office, positioned deceptively on the left wall behind a metal cabinet. Rounding the cabinet, Cruz saw that it was white and relatively narrow, with a worn-out handle and lock. Another bathroom? She concluded. Stone definitely should have heard something if her office had its own bathroom. Noises emanated from behind the door. Cruz pressed her ear to it. She heard shuffling and rustling cloth. There were human whispers, an effeminate rasp. Cruz strained to make out the words.
"You thick-headed, knuckle-dragging son of a bitch," Stone scolded. "Same tired old tricks of yours. I endured it for 20 years, and you're still not done with us. Well, fuck you then, you piece of shit. Your reckoning will come any minute now. Just you wait, dick for brains. Just you wait."
And below the hateful whispers came a voice that was horribly familiar to Cruz. "Let me out. Let me go." She knows, Cruz realized. She's conversing with it. Footsteps wailed up from the bathroom. Cruz jumped, shuffling back behind the desk. The door opened and Abigail Stone stepped into the office, followed by a fog of cigarette smoke. The scent nearly drove Cruz into a coughing fit. The neck of Stone's sweater seemed loose on her shoulder. She readjusted it with a grunt, then noticed Cruz standing behind her desk.
"Miss Cruz, what brings you here?"
she croaked. "Hello, Miss Stone. I was wondering if I could ask you a few more questions." She feigned a smile as she sat down in a chair. If working with Clark had taught her anything, it was that one should pretend they didn't know as much as they really did when interrogating someone. Interviewees were more likely to talk if the conversation felt more open. Stone shrugged.
"Sure, I guess. Not like I have much to do here anyway."
She reclined in her own chair, swiveling on it lazily.
"What with the visitors from beyond the grave holding my building under new management. So, where's your friend Donovan at?"
"I'm no longer partnering with him," said Cruz. "We had a fundamental disagreement about how to handle the investigation. I'm working alone now."
"Men,"
Stone scoffed, puffing on her cigarette.
"Think the whole world's a lump of Play-Doh in their palms."
"Tell me about it," said Cruz, rolling her eyes. "Play it up," she told herself.
"So, what's on your mind then?" Stone inquired. "What nasty things have you found prowling about my place?"
She offered a rather mellow smile. We've seen some things," Cruz replied, treading carefully. "A large diversity of paranormal entities, beyond the scope of what a ghost like Gregory Trent might offer. He's not working alone."
"Son of a bitch," Stone whispered, shaking her head. "He's doing this. I know he is."
"That is my belief too," Cruz agreed, choosing her words with caution. "There are two distinct possibilities. Either he's recruiting demons from wherever they come from, or they're being attracted by extreme anguish and fury. Stone cocked her head, her cigarette held out at a horizontal angle. How do you figure? Well, said Cruz, it seems unlikely that one spirit has the, for lack of a better term, authority to command such a hideous array of demons. It's more likely that they rose up and are laying waste to the building due to a pre-existing surplus of negative energy, like sharks attacking a bait ball. Stone scrutinized her, twirling the ashy stub in her fingers. Exactly how sound is the science of, whatever it is you people do? Cruz shrugged. Imprecise is a kind way of putting it. Stone gave a throaty laugh.
Oh, of course. It's all educated guesswork. Feelings over facts. You feel it's one of those two possibilities. That's the better way to put it. Am I in the ballpark, sweetie?
You could say that, said Cruz. And so am I, she thought.
And pray tell, what could be the source of all this negative energy?
Said Stone, smiling again. Cruz leaned forward. The guise was up. Frankly, Miss Stone, I'd like to ask you more about your relationship with Gregory Trent. Specifically, if it's still ongoing. Stone went motionless. Her cigarette was little more than a burning ember against her skin, but she didn't notice. Instead, she crumbled it up, littering the top of her desk.
You presume a lot, young lady. I have to say, I am impressed. Womanly intuition. I can fuck with that.
I've been hearing voices in the pipes, Cruz said, dropping the ball. A man's voice, pleading to let him go. She stood up. What have you been doing, Abigail Stone? Stone held her hands out in a calming gesture.
Oh, for God's sake, take a Valium, sweetie. Goodness, I guess I can show you, considering you'd understand more than that cantankerous oaf Donovan Clark.
She stood up too, her stiff, withered form seeming to unfurl to full height.
And I also guess you presume what lies beyond this door, then?
She asked, gesturing to the bathroom. Someplace you can talk to Gregory Trent? Cruz said, albeit with some uncertainty. Stone's smile morphed into a sneer.
Talk to him? If that's what you want to call it.
She lurched to the door and swung it open. Cruz followed her, keeping her distance. Then she gaped. The bathroom was darkened and lit by a flickering vanguard of candles. The walls appeared to be flimsy and artificial, until Cruz realized they had been upholstered with newspapers. Amid the faded headlines and fine print were several yellowing portraits of Abigail Stone and Gregory Trent, the exact man Cruz had seen mimicked in the elevator. His countenance had been defaced wherever it appeared, scribbled over with Sharpie, adorned with X'd-out eyes and clown smiles, or scratched away entirely. Stupefied, Cruz almost didn't notice the bathtub nestled against the far wall, which Stone was standing over.
3 years ago, I walked into this bathroom to find his pale, bloated corpse bobbing in noxious brown water. Stone spat. His old buddy Jack Daniels was with him. I never liked that man. He always had a bad influence over Greg.
Stone turned towards Cruz, her eyes like dark pools.
But with or without a drink, he was still a certified grade A cunt.
She pulled open the neck of her sweater, exposing her upper arm and chest. The low light reflected off a jumble of burn marks and scars.
And that's the shit you can see, Stone lamented. You'll never see the bruises, the busted nose, or the broken ribs. And you'll never see the life he took away from me. 20 years of my life stolen by that sorry asshole.
Cruz's eyes flitted around, trying in vain not to focus on the shattering woman before her. But she and Gregory's faces were everywhere. It was only then she saw the actual names among the faded print. There was Gregory Trent and Abigail. Abigail Trent. Stone's lips unfurled her tobacco-stained teeth.
And then he had the nerve, the goddamn balls to just drown in this bathtub. To just call it quits from the world like that. Oh, bet he felt nothing. Bet he closed his eyes for just 1 second and BAM! Dead.
Her bony fists clenched.
That shit-lording bastard deserved worse. Hell's not enough. Oh no. I'm only human. I can't imagine a bad enough fate for Greg.
Her chest heaved with labored breath.
But I can try. Oh, you bet your ass I can try my damnedest.
You're trapping him here, said Cruz. He's unable to move on, and he's bringing all this hatred and violence into this place. You're the one responsible for all that's happened here. Stone spread her arms.
Casualties in our war of attrition, young lady. I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him move on without thinking he'd gotten to me. But I'm bored now. That's why I called you two in. So I could have the last laugh as I watch him get vanished.
You haven't moved on, Cruz yelled, jabbing a finger at her. You'd rather let people get killed than move on and forget about him.
But there won't be any more casualties now, Stone cried with jubilation. Now that you know how bad things really are, you can drive him out for good.
You have no idea what you're dealing with, Cruz protested, her voice trembling. Look what you've done to this place! All the suffering you've incurred!
Release me. Please.
Trent warbled from the bathtub.
Oh, in due time, honey, Stone answered the tub. But I'm not giving you the satisfaction of doing it myself. Miss Cruz, I trust you have all the necessities for an exorcism, or whatever it is you people call it.
Cruz stammered. Clark was the one with a background in the clergy, and she never did more than hold the book open for him as he recited the verses. And despite their 2 seasons' worth of strange happenings, there was never any solid indication they had actually exorcised demons. She remembered that in biblical times, people with unclean spirits, healed by Jesus, were most likely merely suffering from epilepsy. Stone scoffed again.
Don't tell me you didn't bring that stuff with you to a haunted house.
We did, said Cruz.
But nothing,
Stone fired, advancing upon her.
You want to make things better? You want to drive the darkness out? Then do it. Save them. Save me. You evil bitch,
Cruz hissed. Donovan deals with all that stuff, and he's not going to talk to me. Not after I quit on him.
Fuck him,
Stone shrieked, grabbing at her hair.
Fuck that man! You can do it without him.
In a frenzy, she jumped into the bathtub and grabbed the spout, tugging with all her might.
Come on out, Gregory. Time to meet your maker.
No, Abigail, stop! Cruz shouted. You don't know what... The spout wrenched off, and Stone staggered backwards from the momentum. And, before the candlelight snuffed out, Cruz saw a noxious brick-red fog billow from the hole like a mushroom releasing poison spores, blasting Stone in the face. As the room went black, Cruz heard a scream and a painful crash. She turned and wrenched the door open, letting light back into the bathroom. Against her better judgment, she whipped around to see what had become of Abigail Stone. Stone had risen shakily to her feet, her knees wobbling and head down. Her sweater had been reduced to ribbons. She clawed at the remnants until it fell away entirely, exposing her bare chest and midriff. She pressed her fists over her heart, emitting horrible, wheezing breaths.
Gregory,
she rasped.
no, you're not him.
Her eyes rolled into her head. Stone took a loping step out of the bathtub, her limbs swinging erratically. She opened her mouth, but all that came out was a wet, breezy rattle, like dead meat, vibrating in the wind. Cruz found her legs again and forced herself out of the office, slamming the door and backing away into the center of the lobby. She turned for the exit, but fleshy black branches were snaking up the walls and doors, pinching shut her only means of escape. The entire building shook on its foundations, as if an entire parade of demons had raised their voices in a collective cheer. Something pounded down the stairs, and Cruz turned towards it, but it was Clark, clutching a video camera and a manila envelope overstuffed with files.
Ellen,
he shouted, nearly tripping on the bottom step.
what the fuck is going on? What are you doing down here? I found a room full of records and learned that Abigail Stone and Gregory Trent were married. I've got one hell of a lead now.
Why are you... The office door exploded off its hinges and Stone burst out of it, half naked, flailing her arms and spinning in manic circles.
It itches!
She was screaming.
It itches inside me! Get it out of me! It itches! It itches! It itches!
Holy fuck, Clark cursed.
Ellen, what the shit?
I don't know, Cruz screamed, but she barely heard herself over Stone, who had already crossed the lobby to the other side with another door. She lashed out and busted it down too, melting through the doorway into the darkness. Holy fuck, Clark exclaimed, rushing towards the room.
Stop! Don't get near her!
Cruz yelled, running up behind him, but Clark had stopped at the doorway, zooming in with his camera. He switched on the infrared filter. The room was a storage area, overflowing with papers and boxes and office equipment. In the middle was a metal desk which Stone had thrown herself over. Her head seemed to be resting on a short platform. Her arm was above her, seemingly grasping at thin air. Then, Clark boosted the ISO, and the blade of a paper cutter came into view.
My head! It itches in my head!
Stone brought the blade down on her neck.
No!
Clark bellowed, dropping the camera. Cruz had screamed and turned away, only hearing the smooth grind of metal and twin thumps of heavy flesh falling to the floor. Her sobbing mingled with the grisly flow of fresh blood from the storage room. The foundations trembled again, and the fleshy branches crept higher. Everything else had gone quiet, but Cruz knew with an onset of dread that they were not done yet. Clark picked up the camera, running his finger over the lens. He turned towards Cruz.
There's a crack in it now, but no dead pixels this time, so that's a plus. Huh, I can't believe she fucking did that. Oh, Jesus Christ. What could have compelled her to?
He swung the camera around and zoomed in on the headless corpse.
Astonishing developments. You won't be able to see it on YouTube, but remember that our patrons can see uncensored versions of every episode. Donovan, shut up!
Cruz interrupted. He lowered the camera.
What? I said, shut up!
Cruz roared through tears.
For the love of God, stop!
Stop being awful for once in your life. Clark opened his mouth to retort, but his speech was drowned out by noises from the storage room. They raised the camera again. The body was on its hands and knees, the stump of its neck lowered to the ground, as if draining any remaining blood. A rapid, crunchy chatter emanated from its mangled throat, eerily bug-like. From its shoulders and kidneys, 4 giant, brick-red insect legs sprouted and extended, wrapping jointedly around the human limbs and touching the floor. Writhing antennae bloomed from the neck, opening apart like flower petals. A head followed, a head with black eyes and adorned with warty horns, its mandibles fluttering noisily. Blown up, Cruz could see individual plates moving on its face. It most resembled a New Zealand weta, a giant primitive cricket, and before they could react, it stood on 2 legs, mandibles clacking and antennae waving. It pounced on Clark. Some unseen force seemed to drag Cruz away from the carnage, but she knew it was her own survival instincts kicking in. Clark was brought down instantly, his camera crushed underneath a clawed foot. The weta dug into his throat, quelling his screams. As he slowly died, it cradled him in its arms, saggy human breasts swaying freely, slurping up blood and frothing with bug juice. Her adrenaline left her and Cruz collapsed to the floor, overcome with existential tremors. She was trapped. Her prospect of survival was all but dead. Surely the weta's appetite was unbound by natural laws. In time, it would grow hungry again and run her down. And at the end of the day, Gregory Trent still trapped, she rued. We failed. This place will be condemned by darkness. That poor old man upstairs. The weta will get him too. He'll never know what hit him. She forced herself up. No, my job is incomplete. My limits have not been reached yet. Trent was trapped, she remembered. Trapped with nowhere to go. Unable to be freed from his wife's psychic hold. Now, stuck for eternity because there was no way Stone could attain closure now. No way out. Wrong. There is a way out. Ignoring the sucking, mashing sounds behind her, Cruz crawled towards the landlord office. The branches hadn't covered that doorway. Whatever they were probably didn't care if someone found themselves in there. As she worked her way across the floor and into the shadowy bathroom, Cruz reflected on her hopeless chances of making it out alive. That ship has sailed, but that doesn't mean I can't do all I can. She worked her way into the bathtub, lying face down over the drain. She tasted rust and scum. The tub felt like a coffin around her. It might as well be, she thought. Pressing her lips to the drain, she whispered, imagining her voice carrying through the building's miles of plumbing. Gregory Trent, come to me. Wait. What is this? What trickery is this? No trickery, Greg. You're free now. Who are you? Abigail? What are you scheming? Abigail Trent is dead. I'm not her. Why are you doing this, whoever you are? I'm carrying you where you need to be. I am fulfilling what should have been done years ago. I've read your soul. You are Ellen Cassandra Cruz. You're a spicy young woman, that's for sure. Red pepper hot, I might say. Get it? Huh, very funny, Gregory. What good fortune that I now inhabit such a vivacious young body. You and me could go places, Ellen. I could take you places myself, if only you'll let me in deeper. Trust me, Gregory, we are certainly going places. Where are you taking us? Someplace more private? I approve. Someone might hear you scream. I very well might, Gregory. Enhanced with a male spirit's strength, Cruz's body found it easy to pry open the ghostly branches blocking the stairway. They had walked right past the Weta, which was gnawing on severed limbs like carrots. They made it past, but the branches did not let them go unscathed. Great sheaths of flesh had been scraped away by the branches' thorns, and, as the body lurched up the stairs, they trailed double streams of blood behind them. Wow, I like a bit of masochism. Already you interest me more than my wife. She didn't find it fun. She called me a monster, as if that was supposed to hurt. If you like pain, you'll like what I have planned for us. Stop it. You'll make me pop a heart on. I wonder if I can manage it in a woman's body. Here, let me try it out. Hold your horses, Greg. We're almost there. But as Cruz's body ascended the second flight of stairs, they grew slow from impending blood loss. Physical limitations were just that. They had to be quick if it wanted to achieve what they had in mind. How high are we going? You got a penthouse suite up here? The top of town, Greg. You really sweat the details. I must warn you, though. I've been in that harpy's clutches for 3 years. It's going to take more than pain and a penthouse suite to make it all worth it. I intend to indulge in reality as much as I can. Indulge all you want, slut. They arrived on the 4th and final floor. There were no branching corridors, just one long hallway that ended at a window. Perfect. Perfect. What is perfect? Why did you say perfect? Shh. Aren't you a man who likes surprises? As a matter of fact, I do not. Tell me what's going on. Just a minute longer, Greg. The body's legs were growing weak. Soon, they were dragging one behind it, like a cartoon character crawling away from an explosion. The window grew closer, agonizingly closer. This vessel is failing fast, Ellen. What are you doing? I said I had pain planned for us. No! Stop! Let me at the reins! For a scary moment, the body spasmed, as if overwhelmed with conflicting signals. Their arms, once held stiffly like a zombie, had fallen limp to their sides. Staying upright was a challenge, but the window was just within reach. Stop resisting. I only want you to pass on. No, not now. Please, not now. I haven't seen the light in years. Abigail Trent may have been a bitter wretch, but you're no better. Far from it. You don't deserve the light. You psychotic bitch! Stop! Stop! Cruz took control for a split second. Using the last of her strength, she stood up and bent her knees, applying a springing pressure to her heels. You ugly cunt! Don't you dare! Don't you dare! Too many have suffered. You will be the last. No. No. No! The window shattered. The world became a blur of meaningless color. Cruz plummeted through open air, tumbling, the cold breeze feeling like heaven on her many wounds. The shards of glass around her sparkled like raindrops in a sun shower. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. At least, for the entirety of the day. Clyde McDowell had stayed put in his room. Despite his poor hearing, he had detected a hellish commotion from all the way downstairs. He was in no condition to hobble out and investigate. He knew all too well of the boarding house's reputation, the rumors of hauntings. He hadn't experienced it personally yet, but his dreams at the boarding house had been the worst they'd ever been in his 74 years of life. Not even his decades on the streets could have concocted nightmares as twisted as the last few days had been. The sun blotted out for a second. McDowell turned his head to see, to his shock, a body falling past his window. That was what finally compelled him to get up. He limped to the window, cursing his bad leg, and pushed the panes open. "Oh dear," he muttered, staring down at the ground below. It was a young woman, splayed out in the parking lot. Her body appeared unbroken, but the blood pooling around her head told him enough. At least it was instant, McDowell thought as he slunk back inside and closed the panes. He had seen enough suicides out of the streets to feel much sympathy for it anymore. He sat down on his bed and felt a sudden lightness in his lungs. At first, he thought he was about to fall into a heart attack, but everything, from his limbs to his head, felt lighter as well. There was an overall impression of spryness, a vitality he had not felt in many years. Even his bedroom seemed bright. It was as if a mighty pressure had been lifted, like a plug had been pulled, and a drainful of dirty water had finally been sucked away, leaving everything shiny and polished, just like new. McDowell thought little of it as he settled back into his mattress and turned up Jeopardy! Alex Trebek's soothing tones only reinforced his strangely newfound impression that he might actually sleep well that night.
Henry Grayson heard a mournful howl of wind when he stopped to catch his breath. After a harrowing dash through the forest, he rested his head against an old oak's trunk for support. Looking up, bare limbs swayed in the cold fall gusts. Moisture-laden clouds raced northwest to southeast, playing hide-and-seek with the moon. The on-and-off darkness obscured the landscape ahead. A sense of vertigo swept over him as he gasped for air and experienced the altering illumination. Far in the distance, he heard a low rumble. The first evidence of an approaching storm made itself known. His panic intensified. As the thunder grew louder, the cloud density could thicken and reduce the light from the moon. He would be trapped in this nightmare of a forest where directions seemed meaningless. A sudden rustle of leaves from behind spurred him to run again. Only the dimming light from the moon kept him from running headlong into one of the many trees spread out before him. A sudden clap of thunder settled into a low rumble as he struggled to catch his breath. Looking toward the sky, the lunar disk grew more obscure as a solid haze of cloud enclosed around it. Sounds of pursuers grew louder as he plunged ahead. His lungs felt on the verge of bursting. A fallen log tripped him. He fell face down in the thick carpet of leaves shed by their once gracious hosts. Panic engulfed him. He had to keep moving. When he tried to push himself up, a force pressed hard on his back, and his face once again encountered the damp loam on the forest floor. A stinging sensation burned between his shoulder blades, and the vertigo returned. The sounds of the storm faded as his world turned black. Grayson's eyes fluttered open. A strong scent of moist earth permeated his surroundings. Bound to the hard surface where he lay, his arms and legs were immobile. Enclosed by darkness, only a horizontal streak of light could be seen low to his left. The dim radiance failed to reveal any details of the space. A tear trickled down his temple after he blinked to clear an irritation in his eye. Metal on metal clattered above the thin slit of illumination. A door opened, revealing a shadow surrounded by a halo of brightness. "Ah, Grayson, you're finally awake." "No thanks to you. If memory serves, you're the one who decided to take an unauthorized stroll after dark. Did I not warn you about the folly of trekking through the forest at night?" Grayson closed his eyes and remained quiet. "You should thank me. Where you fell is a low spot subject to flash floods, particularly during storms like the one we experienced last night." "I am so very fortunate." "Yes, you are, but I should mention your sarcasm is not appreciated." A shearing pain shot through his lower extremities. He gritted his teeth and took a sharp breath. The silhouette figure said, "Do I have your attention?" Through a clenched jaw, he said,
Yes.
Good. Professor Grayson, the contract you signed with my laboratory specified your expertise in genetics would be at our disposal. You're currently in violation of that agreement. I didn't know you'd be conducting experiments on humans. The man sighed. Oh, Professor, you are so naive. How could we conduct authentic genetic manipulations if we didn't work on human volunteers? You never mentioned that. Grayson heard a chuckle emerge from the gloom. My good doctor, why would I want to use rats? There are plenty of wretched souls in the northern part of this island. Individuals, I might add, who do not enhance the human condition. Experimenting on people is unethical. Please spare me your moral platitudes. If we are to survive as a species, we will need to possess superior senses and intelligence over the coming millennia. Evolution is too slow for man to adapt to the rapid environmental changes we are experiencing. Therefore, it will be up to us to create our own enhancements. So you plan to be the one who provides these improvements by playing God? Playing God has nothing to do with it, Professor. Creating a superior human is the ultimate goal. Can you imagine what wealthy individuals will spend to have a clone of themselves? One that will have enhanced intelligence and senses? It's all about the money, isn't it? Doctor, you are once again relying on flawed Judeo-Christian ethos. Attitudes from a time and place which no longer exist. In today's world, everything is about money and power. I might remind you, money buys power. No, will not be part of your scheme. That's too bad. Another searing pain spread through his spine until Nobel Prize-winning geneticist Henry Grayson, MD and PhD, succumbed to darkness. Galiano Island, located between Vancouver Island and the lower mainland of British Columbia, Canada, is available to mainlanders only by ferry. A long and narrow island, a majority of the land is covered in deciduous and evergreen trees. Access to various parts of the island is by modern paved roads, while other portions rely only on old logging trails. The laboratory, now occupied by Dr. Grayson against his will, resided in a less traveled, heavily wooded, privately owned tract of land near the southern tip of the island. Self-contained with the utilization of solar panels and wind turbines, few individuals knew of its existence or significance. The owner of the land, Victor Dew, protected his privacy and avocation with diligence and resolve. Watching the setting sun, he sat on his veranda warmed by a standalone brick fire pit. The deep purples and oranges on the horizon indicated another storm brewed to the west. After a sip of his single malt scotch imported from the mainland, he turned to his assistant in the chair next to him. I had hoped Dr. Grayson would be more open to our project, my dear. Victor, you need to vet these people better, or it will be the same each time you bring one of them into your confidence. Cheryl Ward sipped a glass of Sauvignon Blanc. She looked at Victor. Your vision is far ahead of the current scientific thought. Most geneticists still look at your research as furthering the practice of eugenics. Nothing could be further from the truth. You and I both know that. However, many of your contemporaries have the perception your research will only benefit the elite. Dew sipped his scotch as dusk turned to night. In a sense, they are right. In the beginning, only those who can afford the procedure will benefit. But like most new ideas and inventions, the costs will decrease as the technology is improved. She sipped her wine and watched the distant flashes of lightning off in the western sky. Yes, my darling, and you will hold the patents on the technology. The next morning, Dew observed the failed experiment through the one-way glass. The individual paced like a caged lion, even though it possessed few genetic sequences from the species Panthera leo. The creature resembled a wolf, but with numerous human characteristics. With the familiar long snout, the similarity ended there as it morphed into the rounded skull of a human female. Hunched over, the forearms were longer than the rear legs, which caused the creature to move with a gait similar to a lowland gorilla. The thick black fur covering the beast appeared to be a mix of a canine and chimpanzee. He folded his arms and spoke into a microphone next to a medical monitor showing the creature's heart and respiratory rates. "Good morning, Heidi." The pacing stopped. She bared her fangs, glared at the window, and emitted a low growl. "You know where I am, don't you?" The snarl intensified. "You have more innate intelligence than you are allowing us to see." The howl changed to a series of barks and wails. She charged the window but stopped just short of ramming it. The head lowered, but the eyes stayed locked on Dew, even though she could not see him. A low-pitched moan resonated through the speakers next to the medical monitor. Turning off the microphone, Dew checked the monitor and saw an accelerated heart and respiratory rate. "Good, your emotions are maturing and producing the proper physiological response." The door to the observation lab opened, and a woman of small stature entered. "Good morning, Dr. Dew." "Morning, Ms. Hines. What are your instructions this morning concerning Heidi's diet?" "Continue with the high-protein, low-carbohydrate combination for another week. We'll see if her cognitive responses continue to improve. I'm very pleased with her progress so far." "Yes, doctor." The diminutive woman shut the door and left. He pulled a chair out from a desk and sat. With a touch on a keyboard, the computer monitor brightened and he retrieved his prior notes. He typed, "Subject has exhibited heightened perception this AM and appears to sense my presence through the observation window. DNA analysis has determined the slicing we attempted did not manifest itself in the precise way we envisioned. However, the appearance of acute awareness by the subject is encouraging. The procedure may eventually be capable of producing the results originally hypothesized." He stopped typing and removed his glasses. Dr. Grayson's input into the process of splicing DNA had taken the project to this point. His refusal to assist further could only be described as catastrophic for the project. Standing, he went back to the observation window to see if Heidi would sense his presence. The creature lay curled up with its head down. As soon as Dew stood in front of the window, she raised her head, stared in his direction, bared her fangs, and issued a low grumble. Hearing the sound, Dew checked to make sure all sounds were being recorded inside the creature's habitat. "Very good, Heidi." Henry Grayson, emeritus professor of evolutionary genetics at Stanford University, stared at the ceiling. His absence and lack of communication with former colleagues would not create any warning signs. Habitually a loner, he never married and lived alone for decades. He rarely saw his housekeeper since she came late mornings once a week, and he had given her notice he would be out of town for the foreseeable future. Remorse consumed him at having taken the position Dr. Dew offered without making proper inquiries. The project and the man's intentions weighed heavy on his mind. Released from the metal table in the laboratory and escorted back to his dorm room, Grayson speculated how much longer he would be allowed to live. He possessed little hope of ever being released to spread the word about all the horrendous experiments being conducted at this facility. He lay in his bed with his hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling when he heard a knock on his door. He ignored it. The knocking persisted, but at a higher volume. Finally, he rose and went to the door. "Yes." "Professor Grayson, it's Victor Dew. I would like to discuss a proposal." "What kind of a proposal?" "May I come in?" "You obviously have a key. Use it." "I would prefer you voluntarily let me in." "Very well." He unlocked the door and let it swing open as he stepped back into the room. Dew stood there, a slight grin on his face as he stepped in. "Thank you, Professor. What do you want?" "Your continued cooperation with our project. We had this discussion the other night. I will not take part in unethical or illegal experiments." even if the one we conducted has proven to be successful? Grayson studied Dew silently for several moments. What do you mean successful? Your work has produced a sentient being. The geneticist from Stanford remained quiet as he determined whether to believe this man he distrusted. He turned his back and walked to his bed. Did you hear me, Professor Grayson? Yes, I heard you. The last time I saw the creature, it did not appear aware of its surroundings. That is a far cry from being sentient. Heidi's awareness and cognitive abilities grow exponentially with each day. Grayson sat on the unmade bunk and studied the floor. Does it have the ability to voice sounds other than grunts? Yes. Looking up, the professor said, I don't believe you. Dew held up a small device and pressed a button. The sound emitted from the small recorder resembled a growl, but Grayson distinctly heard the words, Let me out. The creature paced in the small room, turning to the observation window on every other pass. Grayson said, She is only looking at her image as she passes the mirror. She is not aware we are here. As he finished speaking, the creature charged the glass and stopped just before reaching it. The words he heard on the recording were repeated. Let me out. The voice low and rumbling. You see, Dr. Grayson, she hears you, even though our microphones are off. She senses our presence in the room. Fascinating. Are you now ready to help again? Grayson remained quiet as he followed Heidi's movements. Have you let her outside yet? No, we do not know her strength. The professor turned to Dew. You haven't let her out of the cage? No, all of this development has occurred in the past 3 days, with the only interaction being with her dietitian and myself, all through remote access. No personnel contact. Fascinating. He stayed near the window and kept his gaze on the creature as it paced in the room again. You must find an open space for her to roam where she will be safe. Professor, that is the first time you have referred to it by gender. I beg your pardon? You have always referred to Heidi as it, or the creature, never as a female. Grayson turned to Dew. What did I call it? You said her and she. The professor glanced back at the creature who now lay on the floor of the cage like a content puppy dog, head up and concentrating on the window from which they observed her. He said, You mentioned a DNA analysis earlier. May I see it? Dew handed the professor a manila folder. The man accepted the file without a word and studied the contents. 5 minutes later, he closed it and handed it back to Dew. I see where I made my mistake. 3 months later, Henry Grayson no longer felt the compulsion to dispute the ethics of the experiments he conducted. Curiosity replaced indignation, driving him to work 20-hour days, stopping only briefly for a snack or a 3 or 4 hour nap. His concentration stayed on target day after day without diminishing returns. Victor Dew no longer kept track of him, instead letting the professor follow his pursuits without supervision. On the 3rd day of the 3rd week in the 3rd month of Grayson's renewed enthusiasm, he summoned Victor Dew to meet him in the laboratory at precisely noon. Yes, Professor. Ah, Dew, you're here. I need you to build an outdoor encampment. Folding his arms, the complex's owner asked, Why? If you will remember, when we allowed Heidi to be in a larger space, her progression with perception and language grew exponentially. Yes. She allowed others to get in close proximity to her. Unfortunately, she lacked a gene sequence essential for the development of her immune system. She died of a common cold. I am very much aware of this, Professor. So, why do we need an outdoor area for our subject? To allow them to be exposed to naturally occurring viruses and bacteria. Otherwise, we will constantly repeat what we created with Heidi. Very well. I will have one constructed. Thank you. Late winter. The fruits of Grayson's efforts were 2 beings, one female and one male. Both resembled the physical appearance of Heidi, but with specific changes in their DNA sequencing. The professor's observation of the two subjects occurred from a camouflage deck high above the newly built and enclosed habitat. For lack of a better way to identify them, the professor dubbed them Adam and Eve. Neither showed any aggression toward their human caregivers. From the observations and interaction between them and Grayson, he hypothesized their intelligence to be greater than Heidi's. However, neither had uttered any coherent words so far, mostly grunts and clicks. During an early morning scheduled observation, Victor Dew joined Grayson. "How are your creations doing this morning, Professor?" "I am developing a note of concern about them. While their perception and reasoning skills are far superior to Heidi's, they have yet to develop language." "Language you understand, or are they non-communicative?" Grayson glanced at Dew for a second before returning his gaze on the scene below their location. "Interesting question, Dr. Dew. However, I am a geneticist, not a linguist. Someone with a different skill set would need to determine the answer. I obtained the services of Cheryl Ward before I started this endeavor. She is a linguistic anthropologist and would be more than happy to assist your assessment of Adam and Eve." With a raised eyebrow, Grayson nodded. "I believe that would be appropriate." 2 weeks later, the meeting occurred in the office of Cheryl Ward. "Adam and Eve have a system of communicating which is highly complex, Dr. Grayson." "Explain, Ms. Ward." "What we hear as clicks, grunts, and growls are very specific sounds forming a vocabulary only they apparently understand. I have been able to deduce the meaning of some combinations, but not enough to be able to communicate with them. That will take months." Dew asked, "Professor Grayson, could there be a mutation in the genetic sequence which dictates the development of vocal cords?" "Possibly, but I am most intrigued by how rapidly they developed a distinct language." Cheryl Ward nodded. "I too would like to know how they did it. In most human cultures, language is learned. Vocabulary evolves within a group and is passed from one generation to the next. This development between them is most intriguing." An extremely loud alarm bell sounded. At the exact same moment, Victor Dew's cell phone pinged. Accepting the call, Dew listened as a frown grew on his face. He thanked the caller and said, "No one knows how they did it, but Adam and Eve are no longer in the compound. They've escaped." Dreams, nightmares, hallucinations, and visions haunted Henry Grayson once again. He could not distinguish between them anymore. When he slept, the pictures continued to get worse. He could not get the image of the now dead Heidi out of his mind's eye. Before her death, she had actually allowed him to place his hand on her head. 2 days later, she took her last breath, ravaged by a virus a normal human easily fought off. Now, with the disappearance of Adam and Eve, the consequences of his research began to penetrate his conscience once again. The search for the elusive creatures by members of Victor Dew's staff continued, but so far, no trace of them could be found. On the third day of the search, 2 staff members went missing. Victor Dew paced as he listened to Cheryl Ward. Doris Hines and Raymond Jones did not return from their assigned search area. Per your instructions, all search personnel are to be back before dark. That was an hour ago. They have yet to check in by radio. Where were they assigned? Southwest, to the shores of the Trincomalee Channel. Okay, arm our security personnel and send them in. If it becomes necessary, they are to protect themselves. I'll take care of it. Dew left his private study and took the elevator to the floor below and the location of Henry Grayson's room. He knocked on the door several times without a response. Finally, on the 4th series of rapping on the entrance, it opened. A disheveled Professor Grayson held the door open. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his weariness. The normally clean-shaven geneticist bore a 4-day-old beard. His appearance gave pause to Dew. Are you ill, Professor? No. Have they found Adam and Eve? The question answered Dew's concern. The geneticist's worry about the missing Adam and Eve were dominating his thoughts. No, now we have 2 staff members missing as well. Where were they searching? Southwest. Concentrate your search efforts there. Folding his arms, Dew asked, Do you know something you have not informed us about? Grayson stared at Dew for several moments and then nodded. Should we consider Adam and Eve dangerous? Yes, extremely. Why didn't you mention this before, Professor? Because you would have ordered them euthanized. Crimson spread up Dew's cheeks. He clenched his teeth and glared at the professor. Grayson, if Hines and Jones are not found alive. He turned and hurried to inform the rest of his team. The next morning, at the first light of dawn, 3 jeeps exited the entrance to Victor Dew's compound. Each contained a driver and a passenger. Both were armed with AR-15s chambered with .556 NATO rounds. Instructions from Victor Dew to these individuals demanded if they caught sight of Adam or Eve, shoot to kill. The creature known as Adam observed this activity from the safety of dense underbrush which concealed his location. To him, the past did not matter. Surviving, getting to tomorrow, and protecting his mate did. His mate, Eve, lay hidden 10 meters from where he crouched. Her scent had changed, creating an urgent need within him to protect her. Plentiful amounts of food presented themselves to the 2 creatures since escaping the confines of the building. Within the structure, trees existed, but underbrush did not. Adam preferred the underbrush, which offered opportunities to secure and capture sustenance. A new scent could be detected emanating from the building. The receptors in his snout caused an unease within him, an unease he did not understand until their encounter the previous day with the 2 hairless beings. Fear. The inhabitants of the building feared him and Eve. Instinctively, he knew this to be a powerful weapon, a weapon he could use against those who wished to return he and Eve to the confines of the building. Greg Dubois, head of security for Victor Dew's company, stopped the jeep, turned to the man who held the AR-15, Remy Rousseau, and pointed. What does that look like over there? Rousseau studied the area Dubois indicated. Oh man, I hope it isn't what it looks like. Cover me, I'll check it out. The driver shifted the vehicle to park and reached for his rifle in the back seat. As Rousseau entered the underbrush, Dubois stood ready to protect if needed. Seconds ticked by as he neared the object he sought to examine. It's her, Greg. Get a tarp. After the remains of Doris Hines were covered, Dubois returned to the jeep and reported the discovery on the radio. This is Dubois. I need to speak to Victor. 2 minutes later, he heard, What did you find, Greg? We found Doris. Silence came from the speaker. Finally, he heard, I take it she is deceased. Unfortunately, yes, sir. Without going into details, how did she die? Violently. I was afraid of that. The radio grew silent as Dubois waited for further instructions. I will send someone to collect the body. Don't leave her alone until they get there. Give me your location. After he understood where the 2 men were, Dew asked, Any sign of Raymond Jones? Not yet, sir. Very well. Keep me posted. Originally trained as a medical doctor, Victor Dew's curiosity about creating a superhuman led him away from his lucrative medical practice to the field of research. With the recovery of Doris Hines' small body, he would utilize his knowledge of physiology to try to determine how she died. When he uncovered her on the examination table, he knew immediately the cause of death. Putting the sheet back over the woman, he went to the intercom next to the laboratory door and pressed a button. Summon Professor Grayson to the lab immediately. A disconnected voice replied, Yes, sir. 10 minutes later, an ashen-faced Henry Grayson stared at the mutilated body of Doris Hines. Dew asked, Did you anticipate this, Professor? A slow shake of Grayson's head became the answer. He remained quiet for almost a minute. This is what results when we play God, Victor. You seem to forget that I'm an Eva of your making. Man is not smart enough to understand the delicate balance years of natural selection provide a species. Your obsession with speeding up the process has caused this catastrophe. He turned his attention away from the body and looked at Dew. I was a fool to let my excitement of discovery overcome my repugnance for this research. Grayson, I have never seen anyone vacillate so fast between euphoric enthusiasm and self-loathing as you have. In my opinion, you are mentally unstable, and I have no further need for your assistance. Your contract with this institution is terminated, effective immediately. Now, get off my land. Dew turned and walked out of the laboratory, leaving Henry Grayson standing alone next to the partially consumed body of Doris Hines. The wide variety of sea life in the waters off the southern tip of Galliano Island and the northern shores of Main Island provided a sanctuary of sorts for Harold Betchworth. Now in his early 80s and a widower, his meager pension earned from working 4.5 decades as a longshoreman at the port of Vancouver barely sustained him. He sublimated his earnings by selling his daily catch to restaurants in the Richmond and Vancouver, British Columbia area. His small fishing boat trolled the waters 50 meters offshore of this unusually warm day in late August. With a successful morning behind him, he prepared to raise his nets one more time before heading for the mainland 20 kilometers to the northeast. After raising his starboard net with ease, he stored the catch in one of his many coolers and tossed ice on top. Efforts to raise his port net were not successful. He struggled with it for almost 10 minutes before it broke free and rose. The torn net hung empty as he stared at it. A noise to the stern caused him to turn and witness the emergence from the water of what he would later describe as a spawn of the devil. Henry Grayson boarded a ferry at the Sturdy's Bay Terminal for the ride to Tsawwassen, British Columbia Terminal. He originally arrived on Galliano Island via a car sent by Victor Dew. He did not receive the same courtesy for his journey back to the United States. After finding a secluded spot in the passenger lounge, he settled in for the ferry ride and to contemplate his future. Halfway across the channel, he overheard a conversation between two men laughing about the ravings of a senile old fisherman. When he heard the word wolfman spoken by one of the two, he paid closer attention to the discussion. 2 minutes later, he stood and approached the two men. Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Did you mention something about an old man transporting 2 wolfmen across the Strait of Georgia? The younger of the two men chuckled. Yeah, craziest story I ever heard. He's a local from Saskatchewan who makes a few extra bucks selling fresh fish to a pub I go to. He told the owner about these 2 wolf creatures who came out of the sea and had him take them to an isolated spot on the U.S. mainland. Did they mention where? The man stared at Grayson for a few moments. Nah, I stopped listening after that. Could you tell me the name of the pub? Why, do you believe the old coot? Grayson shook his head and smiled. No, but I like pubs that serve fresh fish. 2 hours later, he entered an establishment known as Rivera's Reef Tavern and sat at the bar. He ordered a fish and chips. After he finished his meal, he asked the bartender where he got his fish. Local guy goes out every morning and is back here by noon with his catch. I normally buy most of it. Why? It's hard to find good seafood where I'm from. Does he guide? Don't know. Never asked him. Know where he lives? I could check with him myself. No, sorry. But he'll be here in the morning a little after 10. You can ask him then. The next morning, Harold Betchworth tied his Everglades Center Console Bay boat to the dock alongside Rivera's Tavern. Henry Grayson stepped up and asked if he could assist. Betchworth raised an eyebrow. What for? I've got it. I understand you had 2 passengers the other day? The old man stopped what he was doing and stared at the stranger. Why would you care? So you can make fun of me too? No, because I know who they are and I need to find them. Betchworth looked hard at Grayson. Let me get my fish sword, and then you can buy me a beer. An hour later, Betchworth wolfed down a sandwich purchased for him by Grayson. After he ate, he sipped on a beer and eyed his benefactor. You never told me your name. Henry Grayson. So, you say you know them? No, I said I know who they are and I need to find them. The old man shrugged. Don't know where they are. They jumped out of the boat about 20 meters from shore and swam the rest of the way. Last I saw them, they were running toward a wooded area north of Neptune Beach. How did they communicate with you? That's the weird thing. They didn't. The male pointed toward the east and I understood what he meant. I'm sorry, he did what? I said the male pointed his finger and I knew where he wanted me to take them. They didn't say anything? Betchworth shook his head. Not a word. I did hear the female growl once, but she was rubbing her tummy. Grayson hesitated to ask his next question. Was there something wrong with her? She was pregnant. They told you? Nope, I just knew. Kind of like voices in my head, but not. Know what I mean? Henry Grayson wanted to ask more questions, but the revelation from the elderly man caused his head to swim. Finally, he said, Let me get this straight. You heard voices in your head? Not voices. Jeez, people would really think I was crazy if I said anything like that. I just knew what they needed, and that's what I did. He took a sip of beer. Did you feed them, Mr. Betchworth? I didn't have to. They helped themselves to some of the fish I'd caught that day. Ate it raw, heads, scales, and all. Thought you said you knew them. Why are you asking all these questions? I need to find them. Good luck with that. The male acted like he didn't want to be found, but I think I know where they are headed. Where? There's an Indian nation not far from where they entered the woods. It's called the Lummi Reservation. Go on. It was more of a feeling than having someone tell me, you know? No, I'm afraid I don't. Grayson stood. Feel lucky you survived your encounter with these two. You are the first human to have contact with them and remain alive. He turned and walked out of the pub. As he went through the door, he heard Betchworth say, What do you mean, first human? The rest of the question could not be heard due to the crashing of waves on the dock. Grayson obtained a map of the Northwest Washington State region and located the Lummi Reservation. After numerous phone calls and transfers to individuals who could not help him, he reached a tribal elder. He made an appointment for the following day and immediately rented a car. Arriving 15 minutes ahead of his appointment at the Sovereignty and Treaty Protection Office, he stood in the parking lot and admired the natural beauty of the surrounding woodlands. At the appointed time, he was shown into the office of the head of the tribal council, Morgan Ballou. The man stood and offered his hand. As they shook, he said, It is an honor to meet you, Professor Grayson. I did an internet search on you before our appointment. You have quite the academic resume. I am flattered you took the time to do so, Mr. Ballou. The man gestured toward a chair in front of his desk. Please, make yourself comfortable. As they sat, Ballou clasped his hands together and looked Grayson in the eye. I will not tell you where they are. I beg your pardon? I know why you are here, and I will not expose their location. The female is with child, and it will be born as a sovereign citizen of this tribal nation. Grayson raised an eyebrow. Mr. Ballou, I do not believe you understand who or what you are protecting. We understand perfectly who we offered shelter to, Professor. Within our culture, all creatures of the earth are sacred. The two individuals we now protect may be more so than others. The conversation continued for another hour, with Morgan Ballou emphasizing the tribe's position numerous times. When Ballou escorted Grayson out of the office, he kept the door open. He stopped, folded his arms, and tilted his head slightly. Professor, we can appreciate your concern for our new guests, but do not attempt to find them. We are an ancient tribe with ancient beliefs and traditions. We will protect the child and its parents at all costs. His glare sent shivers up the professor's spine. By the time Grayson returned to his rental car, night had fallen. A stiff wind blew hard out of the northwest. Moisture-laden clouds played hide-and-seek across the face of a full moon. The scene reminded him of a night nearly a year ago. A similar howl in the wind gusting through the trees reached his ears. It was the night he ran through the forests of Galliano Island, running in an attempt to escape the nightmares he knew existed within the laboratories owned by Victor Dew. Now, due to his own assistance, those horrors had been released into the world.
Chilling tales for dark nights.